All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Come Follow Me with Lolo and Perry. I am Perry,
I am Lolo.
and we are so excited to have you here today. We do have a very special guest with us to talk about First Nephi chapters 1 through 5. Let's go ahead and bring him on, coming all the way from the Vatican, the Pope himself. Hello, the
Hello,
Pope.
my children. It is good to be here.
It is good to have you here, the Pope. This is the literal Pope coming all the way across an ocean, at least from me. Um,
There's at least one ocean involved.
there is at
There
least
is
one
just
ocean
one.
involved. Hey, so the Pope, you are a guest on here. We introduced ourselves to the audience last week. Why don't you go ahead and give the fine folks at home a little self-introduction so we know who the heck you are?
Very
Would
well.
you say the Pope will be blessing us with some information?
Oh, yeah, the Pope is going to, that was, wow.
Sorry, I'm just, you know what? I'm not sorry.
You are on it with the puns today.
I am. I'm super proud of that.
Well, I'm in the
Fantastic.
perfect position to forgive you, so
All right, let's begin our buying and selling of indulgences.
excellent. I hope you brought your wallets. Well, yeah, I am the Pope. A good friend of Tyler's from way back. Grew up together. I was a true believing Mormon. Grew up in the faith for many years. Born in the covenant and all of that. Went on a mission to Uruguay. Came back, went to BYU, and ended up leaving the church as I deconstructed the idea of God. And now here we are.
And now here you are.
Tyler's
Yeah, sorry.
Tyler's asked me to help on this particular episode because I have a little expertise on a couple of the matters at hand. I've studied historical European martial arts for about 7 years now, and I know a little bit about swords and steel and that sort of stuff.
Well,
Excellent.
and you've beheaded several people personally, right?
I can neither confirm nor deny. I think we
That's
have an
fair.
executioner for that here at the Vatican.
I am pretty sure that I can neither confirm nor deny is basically just a tacit admission of guilt. So we will leave that there because we all know that means you have done it. All right. Well, let's go ahead and introduce our topic for the day. Now that you've brought that in, the Pope, we are talking about First Nephi chapters 1 through 5. This is the unexpected journeys of the family of Lehi. And I honestly think that this is one of the most interesting and fascinating sections of the Book of Mormon, and it happens right at the very start of at least what we read. So very excited to get into this today because we have a lot to cover. So what I want to talk about first is the context for what the heck is going on here at the beginning of First Nephi chapter 1. So before we even get into the text, who are we talking about? What's going on? What is the Zedekiah fellow who gets mentioned as this being the first year of his reign? And how did we even get here? So one of the things that's very important to understand, at least for the historical context, is that just before, about 100 years before, the events of the Book of Mormon, you did not have a unified Jewish kingdom in the Holy Land. Instead, it had been divided into two separate kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And not only were these two kingdoms divided politically, they were also divided theologically. And so when we read in Isaiah, or we read in Kings, or we read in these other Old Testament texts from before the exile, we get a lot of this indication of the way that these two separate kingdoms behaved, the way that they worshipped, the way that they engaged with Adonai, with the God of Israel. And with Israel, with the kingdom of Israel, we have a type of worship that ends up being condemned through much of the Old Testament that we have today, because they're the ones who get wiped out, because they're the ones whose records don't actually persist after the Babylonian captivity. We end up largely stuck today with records of a people who thought, well, the reason why those people were destroyed was because they were worshiping God the wrong way.
It's a big thing with God. You got to do it just right.
You got to do it just right, especially the Old Testament God, who is a bit more generally jealous and vindictive, and who has a particular way of wanting ordinances to be done. You have the story of the guy who touches the Ark of the Covenant to try and stabilize it, who God just kills. I mean, these are some later developments that are going to come in along as the Old Testament gets developed. But nonetheless, we have that idea somewhat persisting. And that's consistent with this Bronze Age culture that's engaging with the world around them and trying to understand how the world works, and seeing a decently cruel world that they're now trying to explain in the context of these gods that exist above them.
Honestly, in some ways, I think that kind of God makes a little more sense given
right?
the crazy way the world works. It almost
yeah.
makes more sense that God would be a capricious, narcissistic, jealous, blood-craving monster.
Machiavellian what?
Right. And honestly, there's a reason why a lot of these polytheistic religions, or these polytheistic mythologies, these polytheistic pantheons, all have gods that are a bit more human in their behaviors, a bit more human in their desires, and the way that they end up fighting each other or maneuvering against each other or getting into conflict with one another. And the Canaanite pantheon, from which the god of Israel comes from, is no different from these other pantheons. And while we're not going to go through the entire evolution of how Adonai worship developed from the beginning all the way until we get to the exile, what we will talk about is how the kingdom of Israel had this view that while Adonai worship was the religion, the de facto religion of the kingdom, you could nonetheless worship other deities within that land if you were a foreigner. Like, it was acceptable to be a foreigner to come into the kingdom of Israel, set up a shrine to Asherah or Baal or one of these other deities and worship them. Not preferred, not necessarily encouraged, but it was at least acceptable. And it was understood in the kingdom of Israel that these gods literally existed and intervened in human affairs. The kingdom of Judah, on the other hand, is exclusivist. This land, the land of Judah, belongs to Adonai. It is Adonai's only, and you can only worship Adonai in this land. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. So that idea isn't necessarily written and codified at this point, but it's developing, and it's understood in the kingdom of Judah that you only worship Adonai. And so,
a question real quick, was Adonai the name for God that would have been used then?
So I'm choosing to use the word Adonai in this particular context, largely because my conscience is convicted by Dr. Dan McClellan and his justification for using that word instead of the pronunciation of the tetragrammaton, these four letters of YHWH. The name, as I'm pronouncing it, is how it winds up getting transcribed in like other written texts, right? And how it winds up popping up.
Latin, right?
It ultimately ends up being the Latin. I think it's
Latin
in the
word for Lord, I believe.
Ultimately, and we translate it as Lord in the KJV.
Interesting.
Just choosing to use that term as a way of respecting, at least in this particular setting, of respecting the Jewish community that still holds that as a sacred name.
I see.
But yes, this would have been pronounced differently. It is ultimately the name from which the Latinized term Jehovah comes from.
From Adonai is what you're saying.
From the Tetragrammaton, which I'm saying as Adonai. Yes.
Got it.
And that's again, my conscience convicted by Dan McClellan on that. You can blame him for all of my terrible decisions in using that term instead of pronouncing it just outright.
I think it's a reasonable concession.
No, it makes sense.
If I'm not going to talk about temple ordinances and stuff like that outside this context, I might as well extend that same respect to other religions as well. So, so going back to this, so we can read in like 2 Kings. I think in 2 Kings it gets really, really clear about how the kingdom of Judah is very much into exclusive worship of Adonai, and that you do not have other gods worshipped in the kingdom of Judah within that space. The city of Jerusalem is a holy space that is reserved only for the worship of Adonai. And after the exile, or after the Neo-Assyrian destruction of the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah starts to do these reforms. I believe it's King Josiah that starts to do these reforms that remove these altars and these shrines that have been put up to other gods within the kingdom of Judah, and tries to purify it and make it very, very clear that this is a space that is only for Adonai worship. But the refugees,
It looks like in 2 Kings, it really starts hitting around chapter 4 to 5.
yeah, and where you start to get like Elijah and Elisha popping in, and they start to do these polemics against Baal and other gods. That's where you really start to see this exclusivist view of Adonai presented more clearly in the text. It's present before that, but that's where it gets very clear.
Well, and that's when it really starts with the punishment for going other directions. Like, that's what I was looking for. At one point, they're cursed with leprosy for
unfortunate
for incorrect worshiping. Yeah, it really it can ruin a person's weekend, honestly, if you think about it.
You know, little leprosy here and there between friends is not really that big of a thing, but you know.
But tea and coffee, that's
tea and coffee. You don't want to do that one. You don't want to do that one. Little leprosy though. Little leprosy. So yeah, basically by the time we get to the beginning of the Book of Mormon, what we have is there are a collection of refugees that are going to be in Jerusalem that still exist in the former kingdom of Israel, that would have been brought up under this inclusivist theology, this idea that you can worship Adonai in the context of there being other gods present and actually existent. But they're going to be under at least the ones that are in Jerusalem are going to be in this kingdom that has just gone through this purge of trying to get rid of this idea that other gods can be worshipped in this land. And so there's that dynamic and that tension, and that dynamic and tension survives all the way until at least the New Testament, when we read about how the Samaritans are treated differently from the other Jewish Canaanites.
The Samaritans being remnants of this kingdom of Israel.
Exactly. The Samaritans are the refugees that get left behind, not only from the Neo-Assyrian captivity, but also the Babylonian exile.
So here's my question. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. So pretend that I'm not nearly as versed as you. And
that's why you're here.
If you explained this, we can just pretend like I didn't answer this question. What was the main draw or the main push behind the wanting to make such a solid cut against the poly deity belief system and the one Adonai belief? So what was the catalyst for that shift, I guess, is my question.
I could make a guess.
Yeah, so this would and it would largely be guesswork or surmising, especially on my part. Biblical scholars may have a better sense of the specifics of that particular evolution. But you do have a group of people who, to clarify, I don't think that I made this very clear, both the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah believed in the existence of other gods. This was a question of worship of other gods. It's not until after the exile that the idea of monotheism, as we understand it, was even a possible concept.
So other deities were accepted and believed in, just not worshipped.
So using the word accepted is a bit of the twist here, because in Israel, you would have had a bit more. If you're an Israelite, the worship of other gods is not acceptable. But if you're a foreigner in the land or in the kingdom of Israel, the worship of other gods is okay. And it's okay to have these other shrines to these other gods because we have these other peoples who are in our lands who worship these other deities. But if you're in the kingdom of Judah, you don't do that. And my honest surmising of this is that this idea was a bit of an argument just before the Neo-Assyrian destruction, because the kingdom of Judah is receiving these ideas of Adonai worship from Israel. it's not native to that particular region in that sense. Like they're receiving that in this interplay of ideas, but they really latch onto it. And so when the Neo-Assyrian Empire destroys Israel, the people who are like, hey, this happened because you were allowing the worship of other gods in your land, and Adonai was not happy with that. Now they have this justification. And when you get King Josiah coming in, he is super, super gung-ho about removing any of these other deities from the land. This is where you get like the destruction of the shrines to Asherah, who used to be the consort of Adonai in the older versions of the story.
Well, that's not allowed.
Right, but now she's relegated into being this false deity, this essentially this demon by the time we actually get to like New Testament post-exilic ideas.
How very Lilith of them.
Right. These ideas are developing as you now have Israel and Judah being put into vassalage under these larger empires, and then when Israel is destroyed by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, well, now our whole justification for this particular view in Judah is held up. Clearly, this is what Adonai wants us to do, and so we're going to purge these other ideas, these other thoughts from our kingdom.
That makes sense.
But that doesn't mean the people who are left behind hold on to those ideas, right?
Yeah.
So the people who are left behind are still going to inherit the old ideas. And this is important for building the context because Ephraim, Manasseh, or at least these tribes that made up the kingdom of Israel, are going to have some refugees that are noted in 2nd Chronicles as being in Jerusalem offering up sacrifices to Adonai at the temple in Chronicles. And so the Bible itself, the Old Testament is going to record at least some amount of refugees who would have been inheritors of this idea of more of an inclusivist view of worshiping Adonai present in Jerusalem after the destruction of the kingdom of Israel.
Okay.
And that's some of the context that I think we're going to find. If there was a historical Lehi, that is where he would have received that, or his theology is from that context. All of that gets us to about 620-ish BCE. We still have another number of years to go where we have to talk about how there was an earlier rebellion against the Babylonians and the Babylonian Empire, specifically against Nebuchadnezzar by the king. I do not remember the name of the particular king who was in rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar. And that really annoys Nebuchadnezzar. And so he subjugates even more tightly the kingdom of Judah. And he installs a puppet king. And that puppet king is Zedekiah. And it is if the details for all this are in 2 Kings 24. And
now, is this historically backed or is this scriptural only?
So there is some historical backing for archaeological backing for this particular account. I'm not 100% certain on all of the scholarship that goes into supporting this. I will say that a large portion of the scholarship behind this does make reference or allusion to the Old Testament accounts, but there are other corroborations to the story where we can feel reasonably confident about Zedekiah coming into power as the puppet king of a vassal state to Nebuchadnezzar in about 597 BCE.
Okay. I didn't know if this was like a King Arthur situation or...
with all of this, we do have to, regard this with a certain amount of skepticism, but it's a bit more tested, I would say, than the King Arthur type situation. There's a bit more historical backing to this idea.
Okay.
Especially since there's so much interplay between these particular kingdoms.
That's fair.
A lot of King Arthur's accounts are very internal to the Britons.
The mention of Zedekiah in the Book of Mormon, though, does very concretely give us our context for the
It does. It does. And one of the things that I do want to mention with this is notice the date that I have stated as the first year of Zedekiah's reign. The Book of Mormon at the very bottom of the page will tell you the year as being 600 BCE. And the reason for this is because there are multiple places in the Book of Mormon where it says that Jesus would be born 600 years from the time of Lehi's departure from Jerusalem. And
I mean, what's a little
Lehi, yeah.
So is
right.
this a situation? Okay, so this reminds me of, and I'm going to tangent here, the whole Harry Potter, or was it really the little buddy friend who was supposed to be the chosen one? It was like, well, what if it wasn't Jesus? Yes. Like, what if it wasn't Jesus, but what if it was like Steve down the road?
So I think you're talking about the life of Brian, and that's a different story.
sorry. What was I thinking?
He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. No, so what's going on here is that at about the time that the Book of Mormon was written, it was understood that Zedekiah's reign began 600 years before Jesus was born. Scholarship has refined that idea down to about 597 BCE. Frankly, it's close enough. Like the Pope was saying, alluding to there, like it is so close that we can essentially say, yeah, it's fine. Losing 3 years somewhere, I mean, that's reasonable. The Book of Omni is a great spot to consider where they would have lost 3 years because it's just so mangled with the history that's going on in that particular account with a lot of issues happening. We lose 3 years, no problem. I really don't have an issue with that. It's just worth noting that that's what's going on in that particular section, and that is, it's not really textual information because that was added in well after the writing of the Book of Mormon. If I recall correctly, it's Bruce R. McConkie that throws those dates in there and the other like chapter headings that give the brief summary of what's going on. But just something that people might notice. Okay, so there's a lot that's in this particular slide. What I do want to highlight, though, is that Lehi, as a descendant of the peoples who were destroyed by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, would have inherited a theology that comes from the inclusivist worship of Adonai. Okay. And that this is in tension with the exclusivist worship that's going on in Jerusalem after the reign of King Josiah, especially after the reign of King Josiah.
Okay.
And then also the context for Zedekiah being there, but that's really the thing that I think should be taken away from this about Lehi and the Lehi family.
Well, I think it's important to note, especially with it being, you know, a puppet kingdom and all of the tension, I think that's kind of vital to the story. It helps everything kind of make sense.
Right. And we're gonna, if you go to the Old Testament, you can see mentions of this tension appearing in some of the writings in Isaiah, but especially Jeremiah. Jeremiah is the story for getting what's going on at the ground level under this reign of King Zedekiah just before they're about to be brought into exile. Okay. Isaiah is mostly for the Neo-Assyrian conquest of the kingdom of Israel. We will talk about that when we get to the Isaiah chapters a month or so from now. Honestly, I'm actually really excited for that section, but I know that the Isaiah chapters are a bit of a slog.
Oh, they are so hard.
Right.
Any Mormon would know the struggle.
We'll get to that when we'll burn that bridge when we come to it.
That's actually what pushed me away from the church, is when I just started I just can't do it, guys. I'm out. Sorry.
Isaiah chapters and done. You know, that's as far as I can go. No, hopefully we can make that particular section interesting. But yes, Jeremiah is going to provide a lot of that context for the conditions that are happening in First Nephi, especially in the first couple of chapters. If you want a bit more of the background, you can get that from 2 Kings, from 2 Chronicles, and Book of Jeremiah, with Kings and Chronicles providing kind of a high-level view down, and Jeremiah providing more of a ground-level perspective on those particular conditions. Let's talk a little bit about Lehi and who the heck this guy, if he existed in history, would have been based off the text. And what I want to focus on here is what we learn about him. In 1 Nephi chapter 1, we learn that Nephi, his son, was taught from his father, who had learned from, or who had gained knowledge from the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. Does this make any sense at all in this 7th century BCE context?
This is a good question, because wouldn't the Jews have already had their own language? Why would they need to borrow Egyptian script?
That was my
Right.
question. Is they had written language spoken?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Why was it required? That would be like me teaching my son. We all speak English, but I'm going to teach you in Portuguese.
I mean, we do learn Spanish in school, I suppose, but
I did that pretty poorly, though.
So to your point, right? So you have this mixing of languages that does occur as these different empires are coming together. Jerusalem is going to be a trading spot. There are other like trails that pass through or pass around. There is exchange of culture and ideas. The Hebrew script, as you were alluding to, Lolo, is derived from the Egyptian script. So if we look at which is itself derived from Akkadian and other cuneiform and other older languages. And someone who is much smarter than I in linguistics can kind of walk you through the entire chain of events of that development. But ultimately, we could also say that we have the Latin alphabet that we use today in English, but that is ultimately derived from the Egyptian script as well.
But we don't call it Reformed Egyptian. We call it
right. So
that's I guess that always confused me that he worded it that way, I suppose.
So I think you're right on with that. So if we're talking about the Egyptian script, there's no way that we would refer to that as an Egyptian language or as a Reformed Egyptian or anything along those lines. However, one of the things that had occurred just a bit before the reign of Zedekiah, and even in the destruction of the kingdom of Israel, was there was an incursion into the Holy Land by the Egyptians. And so this is during the reign of King, I'm going to totally butcher this, but Jehoiakim. And
I like it. I'm going to.
Right, I totally butchered that. Somebody
I co-sign on that.
Yeah. And so the Egyptians come in, they make this incursion, and then they just get the tar beaten out of them by the Neo-Assyrians. And that incursion ends. And it's kind of the end of this like middle kingdom of Egypt really doing its expansions and all of that. And right around this time as well is when the Egyptians are transitioning from the hieratic text. The hieratic script that they had been using before, which itself was a change from the earlier hieroglyphics, into what's called the Demotic. And if you know the story of like the Book of Abraham and the papyrus that was used for the Book of Abraham, that was written in the Demotic script. And that develops right around the life of Lehi is the earliest record that we have of Demotic. But there is this interplay, and that hieratic script was picked up in the Holy Land for some documents. And we do have a history of hieratic being used in the Holy Land, and it's called the Palestinian hieratic. And I want to give thanks to Neil Rapalai, who was on Mormonism with the Murph just recently talking about this, brought it to my attention, looked into it, and yeah, it checks out. There is this Palestinian hieratic that is used in the Holy Land at about the time that Lehi would have lived.
That's pretty fascinating.
And I find it
so it would make sense to call it. It would make sense to call it Reformed Egyptian at that point.
So I mean,
so wait, yeah, we're talking about the hieratic, but you're saying the Demotic might be what they're referring to as Reformed.
So here's the thing. The term Reformed Egyptian appears all the way at the end of the Book of Mormon in Moroni, maybe Mormon.
Right.
And it's called the Reformed Egyptian because the people of the New World had reformed it based off their like learning and their customs to suit their needs. And so lowercase r, Reformed Egyptian.
Right.
There are issues with that.
The language of the Egyptians.
Right. At this point, we're talking the language of the Egyptians. Now, we'll talk about this, I think, next week with the order in which the Book of Mormon was actually written, and how the Book of Moroni was likely written just before the Book of First Nephi, and how this might have actually influenced this particular issue. We'll get into that. I think it's next week. It might be the week after, just a bit. For now, what I will say is that I think there is an intended difference between this language of the Egyptians and the reformed Egyptian mentioned later on in the text. I think that there are different things going on. But
So
what we need,
different languages, or
we would consider them different languages
Probably
that are
one
now,
Right.
from the other.
now 1,000 years separated from each other and have undergone a certain evolution in which they're now no longer entirely intelligible, mutually intelligible.
okay, that makes sense.
This is speculation, right? Because we don't actually have the source text, and any appeal to the source text without it being present, any appeal to the translation or the quality of the translation, I consider to be essentially useless for actual like scholarship or actual study.
You just can't do anything with it.
But we're trying to kind of build up what's this plausible possible case for what Lehi, a historical Lehi, would have been. And in that context, we can say, here's where the Egyptian may have come from, and then we could have this potential evolution. The reason why I bring up the Demotic is because I like it better, frankly. The Palestinian hieratic was used for a specific purpose, and we're still trying to dissecting what that purpose would have been, but it's not ubiquitous. And Demotic was at this point in time just developing. It was used for official texts. But I like this. I personally, and because I can frankly kind of insert whatever I want at this point, there's nothing in the source, or we don't have access to the source text that obligates me to one position or another. I like the idea of a visionary, revolutionary Lehi who's taking this new text, this new learning, putting it forward and using it in ways that are a bit innovative for the time. The problem is that Demotic was used for official documents at the time of Lehi. Hieratic would have been more widely used. Hieratic's a fine explanation, and then we can have evolution later on. Either way, we have a particular avenue that we could get Egyptian into Lehi's milieu, and in which he could have been writing in the language of the Egyptians.
Cool.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes it make sense to me.
So again, this is creating a possible case. There may be some issues with plausibility of all of this, and we'll talk about it much later on in the series when we really evaluate the use of Egyptian and how Egyptian is discussed in the text and what that would have been like in the context of the writing of the Book of Mormon. And it's not as clean as all of this, but at least we're trying to create this case for what may have been a historical Lehi had he existed. And then one of the things to note is that while the Book of Mormon here puts Lehi in the milieu, the time of Jeremiah and the last of the pre-exilic prophets, there are no extant writings, no extant Jewish writings that we can find that mention Lehi as being among these prophets.
So that's not something that comes up in any Judaic writing of
Nothing.
any.
Yeah,
at all?
we have no mention of a Lehi at this time.
I think if there was such a mention, we would all surely know about it.
I was going to say,
come up in
as LDS people.
Yeah.
We would have all.
You would find this all over fair. Like it would be one of the most interesting. We're going to talk in a couple of weeks about the most interesting physical evidence for the Book of Mormon. Honestly, First Nephi is loaded with some really fascinating, interesting things. And we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But this would beat that particular evidence if we found some sort of mention of Lehi in
at
this
all.
Jeremiah context, this pre-exilic context. And we don't see that. So that is our historical Lehi, who is coming from the destroyed kingdom of Israel, who would have received this inclusivist Adonai worship in an exclusivist context, and who has learned Egyptian because of an incursion into the Holy Land, is probably using some variant either of the Demotic or the Palestinian hieratic, and who is rubbing shoulders with Jeremiah and the other great pre-exilic prophets right in the first year of the reign of King Zedekiah.
But he's not mentioned anywhere. Got it.
But
Okay.
he's not mentioned anywhere. This dude is absolutely like fascinating, actually, as a historical figure. So to not have him mentioned in other extant texts kind of hurts in trying to rebuild this character historically. The other big guy that we have to mention in this is Laban. Now, Laban would have been another refugee or a descendant of refugees coming in from the kingdom of Israel, receiving the same inclusivist Adonai worship theology in an exclusivist kingdom. And he was super, super wealthy. I mean, this man was, the way that he is described is he has connections with the religious elite. He has immense wealth to the point that he can command a small army. He himself is supposed to be quite capable, quite strong.
Yeah, he could command 50 or slay 50.
Slay 50, right? So, I mean, this is intended as hyperbole, I believe. Like, I don't think that Laban, a historical Laban would have actually been able to kill 50 dudes. But he likely would have been had renown as being a capable fighter.
You don't get rumors like that said about you, unless you are.
And given what the Sword of Laban would have been in this particular context, and we'll get into this in a bit, but given what the Sword of Laban in its context would have been as a weapon, it would have been one of the legendary weapons of the time. It would have been like Excalibur, just so much more powerful than these other weapons, capable of doing like great and devastating things had it existed as described in the text.
And there's no historical reference for Laban either. Is that correct?
There is no historical reference to Laban despite these connections. Now, granted, not every wealthy person is going to be mentioned in history. And his entire household would have been wiped out by the Babylonians coming in just a few years later if he doesn't get murdered the way that he does in 1 Nephi chapter 4.
So there would have been no reason for him to show up historically in documentation.
Well, now here's the thing about that. We now have this story of a very wealthy refugee who has like ascended to great prominence within the kingdom and within this religious community. It's hard to, on the one hand, say that, yes, we should find record of him. And then on the other hand, say, no, we shouldn't. But it's kind of a toss-up because of how turbulent this time is. I could see a good case being made for why we wouldn't find any records of him. But also, given how connected he is and how wealthy he is, to have no mention of him is also a certain curiosity.
Yeah. I mean, how many people are actually mentioned? How many people from this time period do we even know about, though?
I feel like if he died in the way that he is purported to have died in the scriptures, I feel like that would have at least made, mentioned somewhere.
I think it would have made the front page.
You're right. This is what I think actually changes that calculus a bit, is that he dies in he dies in circumstances that are not unlike those of a drummer in Spinal Tap. Very mysterious circumstances. But yeah, it does strike me as being a bit problematic, but also to this point, like there are not many consistent records, and archaeology Mother Nature is a cruel mistress that makes archaeology, like any finds in archaeology, pretty incredible. But for Jeremiah to not mention this guy, for no allusions to be made to this, in any of the Old Testament texts that we have, is a bit interesting. It doesn't rule out the case that he may have existed in history, but this is another very interesting individual who has no mention anywhere else. And there is no discussion of the context in which he would have lived in the Book of Mormon either. So the text that we have does not really discuss this particular context in any meaningful way, which is also unfortunate.
Over the details, yeah.
Right. There is no mention of how like Laban could have come into this wealth. What made him so well connected? What made it so he was so well regarded among the religious elite? Or how did he come into all this fortune? None of that is really described.
novelization of this story. I need like a mystery thriller on like trying to figure out
Right.
who killed
Right.
Laban.
And now it's possible that in the lost 116 pages, more details of all of this that put this into context would be available. That isn't the text that we have. And so
We
any
would all
appeals to
love to
that
hear
text,
those.
I would love for scholars to have access to the source text and to be able to actually analyze it, study it, and to really figure out like who these people actually were. But unfortunately, we
Right.
don't have that. And so we have to go with what the text actually tells us. And what we have is just this absolute aberration of history who appears here for a few chapters, is murdered, and then just vanishes and doesn't appear again.
Interesting.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit more about just how filthy rich Laban would have been when we talk about his sword here in a few chapters, or in a few slides. But we're going to go ahead and talk about him just before he dies. And so, to be clear, we talked about this aberration of history, this person who would have been just an exceptional figure to study, to learn more about, who is going to get blitzed out drunk, wind up on the side of the street, and there's nobody around. Now, to be fair to this particular story, the children of Lehi do try. They do make at least a couple of token attempts to obtain the brass plates that they need, this record of scripture that they need, apparently, beforehand through peaceful means, whether it be through asking. Laban tries to ask really, really, really nicely. Then they try to bring in some money and buy it, and these things don't really work. And on the night of his murder, Laban's servant Zoram, who we're going to get into a bit later, believes that Laban was out to have been drinking with rather than having been out drinking, to have been with the religious leaders of the community. This ties in earlier with his connections to the religious elite.
With the brethren of the church.
Yeah, exactly. And instead, what we have is a very inebriated Laban who had been partying so hard that he's now unconscious on the side of the road.
So explain to me how there is just some billionaire chilling on the side of the road and he doesn't have bodyguards. He doesn't have, that's what I was.
None of his buddies helped him home.
Right.
He didn't call an Uber.
He doesn't have a harem attached to him. He doesn't have there's nothing, right? Like, so you've been out drinking, but for what purpose, right? Like, what was going on?
You can't tell me that Kim Kardashian, if she passes out on the streets of Hollywood, somebody's not going to notice or help her.
Right. I mean, the equivalent to this would be, like you've got like a Bill Gates or an Elon Musk just passed out on the side of the road, just one of the wealthiest men in the city. I mean, to command an army, a small army, to have that kind of wealth in this time, it's immense. And I highly doubt that Zoram was the only slave of Laban at this time. Like, Laban owned an immense amount of wealth, has his own treasury, like is incredibly wealthy, and would have been quite a prominent figure. And here he is, just passed out on the side of the road. And there is nobody who notices. I get it. It's nighttime. It's dark. This is pre-industrial revolution. There are no light bulbs and lamp. Right. Lighting is at best minimal. But where are this man's bodyguards? Where is this man's harem? Where is this, like, anything for somebody to keep track of what's going on with this dude? And this is one of the first issues that I actually have with this text, or with the textual account of what's going on, is that there's just nobody around when Laban is murdered. Nephi just stumbles upon him. Let's talk about Nephi. So Nephi is a young man of large stature. He is very fond of following his visionary father and his visionary father's claims of divine revelation. He would have also inherited this particular view of God, and that his father possesses. This is what he's got the learning from. He acknowledges this in like the first couple of verses of his own book, that he has been a good student under his father's tutelage. And here he comes upon this particular unconscious Laban, left alone in the middle of the street. He has gotten into the city of Jerusalem under the cover of darkness. And
hadn't he also just been beaten up right before this?
Yeah, he had been. This is a good point.
Rod.
He was beaten with a rod. Saw an angel, so that's cool.
Saw an angel, yeah.
But yeah, he had been beaten with a rod. But he does believe that the Lord is going to provide a way for him to obtain the brass plates. Remember, this is the objective. The objective is to obtain the brass plates. This special scripture, which we do need to discuss in a later episode, or maybe a side episode, about what was on the brass plates and some of the issues, the historical issues with what's claimed to be on the brass plates. We may get into that when we talk about the Isaiah chapters.
Right.
But
the books of Moses may not have existed in written form at that point.
They did not exist in written form at that point. That's not really a may not. There are maybe one or two of the books that were starting to be compiled together in some written form by that point, but the Pentateuch, as we have it, and as it's alluded to even throughout the Book of Mormon text, as coming from the brass plates, did not exist.
Interesting topic for another day.
Yeah, it's going to be relevant in a few places, so we do need to cover that at some point. Anyway, we have Nephi here going after this particular book. This is the objective, but he finds an unconscious Laban who is now removed from the equation. Laban is a non-factor for as long as he remains not conscious, which is like, hey, this dude is hardcore drunk right now. The Spirit of the Lord, so Nephi unsheathes Laban's sword. He's like, ooh, what a pretty sword. We're going to talk about that sword.
Also what I would have done, to be honest.
Right. I mean,
I would have taken the sword, just to swing it around a little bit.
And honestly, it may be a retcon. He may have been swinging the sword around and accidentally cut Laban's head off.
I was going to say, I know that I personally, if I had a dime for every time I've done that,
every time. I mean, he may have been just goofing around, doing what kids do with swords, accidentally cut off the dude's head. It's like, oh, dang it. Ooh, you know what? The Spirit of the Lord told me to do this. Whoops. And here's how I did it, actually, guys.
I promised, Dad, it wasn't murder. God told me
it was not involuntary manslaughter and none of that. This was the Spirit of the Lord. Yep. That is possible. That's not what the text says. And
that's just a joke.
Right. Now, what we do get is the Spirit of the Lord saying, slay him. It is better that one man should perish than that an entire nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief. Those are the exact same words that Caiaphas, the head of the Sanhedrin, will use to justify the execution of Jesus in the New Testament.
Crazy.
So there's an issue here with the Book of Mormon quoting the New Testament at this particular point in time. That is one particular problem that we can talk about, that we will talk about when we get to sections that I think are more relevant to that particular point. What I think is interesting is that the Book of Mormon is going to claim that the Spirit of God is going to basically say the exact same thing that the apostate head of the Sanhedrin will use to justify the killing of the Son of God.
That's a little odd. That's a weird role reversal there.
Right? When I was on my mission, I actually had a conversation with a Seventh-day Adventist about the Book of Mormon, and this was his hang-up. He had some other hang-ups about the Book of Mormon as well.
I was going to say, there's probably a couple others.
But this was, he got about the star.
This is one I'd never really heard before preparing for this episode.
This was his hang-up, though, was like, why is he using this particular justification? This is what Caiaphas uses. And yeah, it's something that should, raise some question marks. But sometimes I guess it's possible that a good God would use, or that an evil man would misquote a good God or something along those lines. Or, you have in the New Testament, you have Satan like twisting scripture to certain ends and all that. Like there are justifications we could come up with this. I find it notable that this is the justification that's used. And I also don't think it's a very good justification.
Yeah, it's a bad. I think it sets a bad precedent.
Right.
It
Because
justifies,
here was. Oh, I'm
it
sorry,
justifies. No, it's okay. It justifies, you know, a heinous act for it. It's the ends justify the means. Famously, not exactly the best the best line of reasoning.
Well, and the thing for me is there are ways that Almighty God could have instructed this young man to accomplish the same goal without, you know, having to murder somebody. It's like Batman going against his no kill thing. You know, what is the just, like you said, that it doesn't justify the means when you could have kept him knocked out. You could have converted him. You could have done a lot of things. You didn't have to kill him.
How many stories are there in scripture of God causing a deep sleep to come upon people? Or, I mean, like this happens in the Book of Mormon, where people become so drunk that there's a story later on where the Nephites will lay siege to a city. And the way that they're going to do it is by smuggling in wine, getting the Lamanites in that city so drunk that they're going to become so unconscious that they're going to sneak in weapons to the Nephite prisoners that are held in the city. And the Nephite prisoners are going to arm themselves with these weapons and stand around all of the Lamanites who are inebriated with their weapons held out long enough that then when the Nephites when the Lamanites wake up, they're gonna be like, oh crap, I guess we're beaten because of this weird Trojan horse situation that was just played out.
That's an interesting parallel because, yeah, Laban was also just completely drunk.
I was like,
in the other version, they just take him captive. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I want to be fair because I've mentioned before about how like I've been influenced by Dan McClellan in a lot of my approaches to scripture. And one of the things that Dan McClellan will talk about is how you cannot assume univocality for the Bible. In other words, you can't assume that what is said in one book of the Bible and what's said in another book are intended to be the same thing. So if a certain word is used this way in Genesis, but it's used a different way in John, you can't assume that the same intent was being put in those particular places. These are different authors writing in different times for different audiences. The Book of Mormon, on the other hand, is pretty clear about its intended univocality. And we're dealing with the same God, with the same theology kind of throughout the text. And that's intentional in this text. When we have this scenario, a similar scenario resolved by one means, and then in this another story, the same means are provided, but the scenario is resolved differently, it's troubling. It's troubling when that scenario is more violent and even more directed by God. And yet it could have played out in ways that were more peaceful.
On the other hand, however, this is the God of the Old Testament, right? This is the I wanted the blood God of the Old Testament. I mean, he's this is kind of on brand for him, in my personal opinion.
But the same God is going to be involved in the story of Alma. Right. So, I mean, we're not changing theology here at this point. We're not changing the deity that's in place at this particular point. This is the same deity giving the same sorts of, in theory, should be giving the same sorts of commands. Mm-hmm. But we see a more peaceful, I mean, still a violent resolution ultimately in Alma, but it's at least a more peaceful approach at the start. And that's during war. That's in wartime conditions where a more peaceful approach is taken through the subterfuge. But that isn't what's happening here in a situation where you just need one person to basically sneak into the treasure room to steal the treasure and come out of that room and sneak all the way back to the camp where they weren't being followed in the first place.
Well, and my question is, they go on and on in the Book of Mormon. Sorry, that's George. He's wanting.
Hi, George.
He's wanting to participate. They discuss multiple times, and Nephi, and I can't remember exactly where, talks about the consistency of God and how God is consistent always, and today, tomorrow, forever, yesterday. But this very consistent God gives those vastly different solutions to very similar problems. How come? What's
now
the difference?
this, to your point, this story is not going to be used as part of the justification, but I really want to avoid bringing in church history as much as possible into our discussions directly, but this is to discuss the consequences of this type of thinking. When you read the happiness letter, which was used as a way to convince an underage girl to participate. I'm going to use these words as generally as possible, but then generously as possible, but try to put them in little italics to suggest that they are being used in sort of a tongue-in-cheek way to participate in polygamy. The justification that's used is that in one scenario, God is like, hey, don't kill. But in this other scenario, he says, thou shalt utterly destroy. This is the same type of justification here appearing in the Book of Mormon. And so I would say that idea is, in sort of the broader picture of Mormonism, theologically consistent. It's doctrinally consistent. That doesn't mean it's good, and it's going to have very negative repercussions. And I'm with Patrick Mason on this one. Polygamy was bad. Mormon polygamy in particular was bad, and is bad. It is still going on today.
I meet polygamists pretty often at the store where I work. Nice people, but it is odd.
Yeah, and it's an exploitative system. It's a very it is not a benefit to humanity to have that particular system of polygamy brought on. I have no qualms with polyamory, generally speaking. If people want to do that, that is for them. Great, as long as it's done ethically. And Mormon polygamy is not an ethical practice of polyamory.
I was going to say those are vastly, vastly different, because one is the equivalent of a loving, fulfilling relationship amongst multiple people. The other one is slavery.
I mean, you're not wrong. It's an aggressive term, but it's also not an incorrect. It's not an incorrect term for a lot of what's intended in that.
Because they keep, the women are subjugated at such an early age,
and to such an extent.
Yeah.
And all that is justified using the exact same justification that's going to appear here in 1 Nephi chapter 4. And again, I want to make clear, this section is not used as a justification in the happiness letter for that practice. However, the same idea, the same line of thinking is employed. So I hope that that's clear, that I'm not saying that this is a justification for polygamy. I'm just saying that the thought process that's involved in this is the same. Okay. Hopefully good and clear. So let us talk a little bit about the Sword of Laban. And actually what we're going to talk about is an archaeological find that might be the Sword of Laban, or at least might allude to the existence of a possible historical Sword of Laban.
Yes, exactly. Because of course, obviously, it wouldn't be the actual Sword of Laban unless the man had a collection, which, I mean, couldn't blame him. So yes, the Very Jericho sword. It's a very interesting find found in Israel, I believe, around in like the 80s or 90s. There's not a lot of great information on like its exact find date, but it was found in Jericho, or around the site of Jericho, which is why it's called the Very Jericho sword. Very interesting find for a lot of reasons. It's actually in the Israel Museum right now, and dates to the 7th century BC, is right around the same time of the story we're going for. Another source I found puts it even closer to like 600 BC, almost exactly. This was a source that was disagreeing with what's on the Israel Museum website, interestingly enough. But yeah, interesting sword, a big weapon for the time period, 42 inches long. That's as big as a lot of medieval one-handed swords. That's a big sword. A lot of bronze or Iron Age swords tend to be a little shorter because of the materials involved. Bronze and iron being more likely to deform, right?
Right.
So,
I one of the things I think is noteworthy is that for a long time, one of the popular critiques of the Book of Mormon has been that there was no steel at this time. Like there was no actual intentional, deliberate forging of steel, particularly of steel swords, during the era in which the Lehites left Jerusalem. And so the Sword of Laban could not have existed because it is described as being this sword made of exceedingly fine steel. And that just doesn't make sense in this particular context. But the Vera Jericho sword is going to challenge that particular critical argument.
exactly.
So I have a devil's advocate question here. Because obviously, the Book of Mormon was not originally written in English. Could it have been a mistranslation when they say of the finest steel, or is that
Probably not.
The intention, or some of the arguments that were intended before, as like apologetics to this, was that what was really intended was like a fine bronze or like whatever the best metal of the time was. That was what was on the source text, right? And this is it. We're like right at the end of the Bronze Age. We're getting into Iron Age 1. And we're in that weird transition period here. And that is a later development from the earliest like critical arguments, actually finding all of that dating. So the original apologetic or one of the earlier apologetics on this, besides we'll find it one day, is what was intended in the source text was just a really like fine, strong metal that was like whatever the best of the best was at the time. That was what it was intended. And because Joseph Smith is translating this into his language, what he uses is the term steel, because steel is what's the best metal of his time.
I think that's a weird argument.
It's a weird argument.
Apologetics
strange.
goes to strange places sometimes.
It
kind of tripped over itself in this case because there have been finds of steel. I put steel in quotation marks because like the degree of steel, what type of steel, it's all pretty complicated. There are finds of steel that are way older than 600.
Right. And as we have learned about those, that apologetic has tapered off.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And
you just go back to, there was steel.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. That's exactly what they said. Look, there's steel. And so then the critical argument changed to, kind of like the deliberate, production of this type of steel, then used in this particular like context of weaponry, not in like ornamentation or in like the other types of ways that steel may have been used, or like small pieces of armor, however it would have been used. And a lot of the earliest examples of steel that you find are somewhat accidental. You get like a little bit of like working with like some iron as iron, and some carbon manages to slip in, and now it's steel. Whoops, I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't have the technology necessary to really deliberately create this type of steel, but it appears in. I'm happy to have it. What a great happy accident. Now I'm going to use it for this purpose.
The chocolate's in the peanut butter now. It's amazing.
The peanut butter's in my chocolate. This sword is different because it is deliberately forged of this mild steel. It shows like an intentionality of using this particular kind of steel in this particular context of a weapon, of a sword.
Yeah.
And
are you meaning the Jericho sword or the sword of
the very
Laban?
Jericho sword?
Sword of Laban, we have no object to study.
And because of that, we have to make assumptions about what the Sword of Laban would have been. And this particular find, I think is kind of devastating for the earliest critical arguments against the Sword of Laban and its existence.
So one of the interesting things about that steel topic with this blade is that, the problem we have with this blade is there's just not a lot of research done on it. We have a couple fragments of the articles that were written on it that are available on the internet. We have like literally like a paragraph or two that we can look at without like spending money and getting into these journals and stuff, which, none of us really have the budget for. But in that paragraph, it does say that like it's like microradiology, radiography, or
Radiography.
something like
I think it's radiography in this case.
shows that it was mild steel, and the same paragraph says it was deliberately forged to be so. That's what the people who wrote that article believe. The other source I found claims that that is a ridiculous assertion, that it was deliberately made to be mild steel, but then it doesn't elaborate, which is extremely frustrating. But I think at least what we can say is that part of this sword was mild steel. At least the part that they tested was from the blade, the edged part. It's possible that other parts of the sword, the hilt and this prominent central ridge, were your standard iron of some variety, wrought iron probably. The
Which
website
would have been a lot easier to produce at the time.
Exactly. So you use the most precious steel for the part that needs to do the steel stuff, and then for stuff like the handle, like the tang, the part that you grab, and the central rib, you would use a different material that's not so precious or hard to make. And this is actually something that's done throughout the ages where people are using swords. Right. European swords, the tangs are wrought iron. They're not steel, because even then steel's precious.
Interesting.
So this makes a lot of sense. The website lists the material for the blade as iron, and I think that's just an issue with the writing. This is something that happens in a lot of scholarly writing on metals.
I think it's an academically safe describing the material of the sword.
Exactly. It's very academically safe. I have seen in other places people complaining about like, oh, well, these articles all say this stuff was made of copper alloy, and that could be anything from bronze to brass.
Right.
So you can't just say, oh, it says iron on the website. Like, why are you saying it's steel? It could be all sorts of things. Steel, iron is the umbrella that steel lives under. So,
and when we use the term steel today, it means a lot of different things as well.
Exactly.
We could be talking about a low carbon steel that's like not necessarily, I mean, that would have been amazing at this time, but that is pretty low quality by our particular standards, all the way up to like these really like strong like steels that are like infused with like super alloys that we could still call it a steel, even though it's a super alloy material, and it's capable of like resisting temperatures that are close to the temperature of the sun. Like we're talking about like just this really wide range of possible options that we use the term steel for today. And yet, so when we're using these other terms in like these academic settings, it's, it's easy to say like, oh yeah, this is a steel, but that might mean, something from a very strong material all the way to something that's fairly, not that high quality today.
Exactly.
So would calling something steel denote what its base metal is going to be made out of? Is that what puts something in a certain?
Steel is an iron alloy basically, but in particular what we're looking for with most steels is a carbon infusion into the iron. It's usually that relationship between carbon and iron that makes it a steel.
There's a lot more ways you got to steel as well.
Right.
So it's the combination of those two types.
I have intentionally oversimplified that issue because what becomes a steel versus what's not and all that is for material scientists to debate. And I slept through most of that class. It was at 7:45 in the morning. It was my only engineering class that was that early. And even the professor was asleep. He hated that class. Anyway, not great.
I went down the rabbit hole reading some stuff about steel from a material scientist, and it was hard to understand.
It's a slog. It's a slog even when you're like excited and interested about it.
Yep.
Let's see if I can get a little bit better lighting in
regardless here to sum this up, the very Jericho sword shows that we have a sword with steel elements that would have been at the time a very precious weapon. So Sword of Laban steel is possible.
Right. And so, yeah, I'm going to take that critical argument that says that we know that the Book of Mormon is not historical because the Sword of Laban is a historical impossibility, it's a total anachronism, I'm going to take that argument and really set it to the side, because we've gone from it being impossible to this is a possible weapon.
I was going to say, this proves that it is absolutely something that was doable.
However, with that in mind, what we have is a question of plausibility. And I don't know that we actually have the Sword of Laban yet as being shown to be plausible, because in your research, the Pope, what have you found as being like the purpose of this particular weapon, of this particular sword?
That's a great question. So it's listed in the Israeli Museum as a ceremonial item. Now, archaeologists love to throw that term around. They love to drop ceremonial on stuff that they just don't quite understand. I would say that this is a stabbing sword. It's got a prominent central ridge. It comes to a nice little point. You could cut with it, but it's going to be great in the thrust.
Gotcha.
And the steel on the edge would make for great cuts. The shape of the blade might make it a little hard to do those head chopping actions because it has that prominent central ridge.
We'll get into that, but it's no, this is interesting, and you're right. Like, the use of the term ceremonial might be a little liberally applied in these contexts. We want to be academically safe.
Yep.
But I think it's important to at least understand that this weapon would have been exceedingly expensive at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, this is
Master
probably
craftsmanship, probably.
This is probably Laban's most ostentatious display of wealth, if he possessed a steel sword at the time.
Okay, but think about it. Bill Gates, Elon Musk, these guys with that just richer than God kind of money, they have these incredibly ostentatious things that nobody needs. So if you've got the money, of course you're going to want to flaunt it. And that kind of seems like
sure,
right up Laban's alley, you know?
Sure.
I'm going to get drunk at the bar and show all my friends my super rad sword.
How does this super wealthy man, though, end up drunk on the side of the road with nobody around and nobody noticing? I mean, this then ties into those issues, right? We have Laban, who I agree, like, if he's got this much money, why not buy one of the most ostentatious displays of wealth you possibly can? Show it off to all your friends. In fact, walk around town with your sword on your hip and your armor on when it's, you're just going out drinking with the boys, but still, like, put on this display. And yeah, it makes a certain kind of sense. But then how do you wind up in that scenario from that? There's a disconnect in this account.
And for me, that's always going to be where I just can't get past that, because you can't tell me this super billionaire guy doesn't have somebody watching out for him when he is that incredibly inebriated.
Yeah. This really reminds me that one of the things I wanted to mention earlier that I somewhat forgot to is that when we talked last week about the historicity and the truth value claims of the Book of Mormon, what we talked about was, on one extreme, you have, like, the Book of Mormon is 100% historical. This is largely what, like, the Brighamite section of the overall Mormonism movement really, like, wants to emphasize, is that the Book of Mormon is historical. Even if it's not a history textbook, it is at least these events happen in history. And then on the extreme for, like, the critic, is that it is 0% historical. None of the events described happened in actual history. And then between that, you have any possible option of the degrees of historicity. It may be a tiny bit historical. It may be extremely historical, but not 100%. But where are we actually playing at with this? And what this story is showing us is that what we're already seeing in our discussion here, and we're going to get into some stuff that I think is even more compelling, is that 100% historical reliability is probably an overreach that cannot be supported by any sort of, like, rational approach to this text. And so we have to go with less than 100% historically reliable. We're already seeing the seeds of that here. We're seeing that as we talk about, if we have a Laban who possessed a sort of that sword, like, that's possible. but then there are parts of the story that don't necessarily jive together and make sense.
But I guess here's my question is, if you're going to use the, well, it's symbolic, well, it's a parable argument, what is the benefit to fabricating this story? It goes against, the whole do not murder. It goes against what we see God doing in very similar situations right down the road. So what is the benefit to fabricating something like this?
I think that's an excellent question. And yeah, I don't know that I've got a very good answer to it. We can take a look, though, when we get to the end of this section. Let's see if we can loop back to that particular question, maybe find an answer. And maybe we'll have to be a little bit unorthodox in our approach to get there. But there might be a benefit to approaching this story.
What?
Yeah. But we might be able to find an answer to that question. That there might be a benefit to this story if we don't look at it at the surface level of what's projected or directly intended by the text. Let's see. Have we exhausted the information on this slide, or is there anything more you want to cover about the Vera Jericho sword?
No, not at the moment. I think we've gone over it pretty good.
Okay.
Neat find, cool sword.
This is an incredible archaeological find. Like I know that we're talking about this in like the apologetic context and what it means for all that, but this is a really cool find that I think we should all be really excited about, like the implications of what this might mean for like the development of forging iron and steel, like at the end of the Bronze Age, going into the beginning of the Iron Age, how blurry those lines may have actually been. What some of our,
I find it amazingly fascinating.
This is a very interesting discovery in its own right. And if we remove it from this apologetic conversation and look at it in that context, we still have something that's absolutely incredible.
I agree.
All right. Let's talk about the murder. And I'm calling it that because there's no other really accurate term for this. We have somebody who is defenseless, who is made unalive by the deliberate actions of another human being, and it was not lawful under the laws of the land. Had Nephi been grabbed afterwards, he would have faced pretty severe consequences for this particular action. And while the law of Moses, as we have it today,
I was going to say, I don't know if that would hold up in a court of law.
As under the law of Moses, as we have it rendered today in the Old Testament, that didn't necessarily exist at the time, but still, generally speaking, cutting off the head of the wealthiest dude in the city is not going to endear you to the rest of the population, even if "Eat the Rich" is a popular exclamation among revolutionaries.
I was thinking earlier about, like, what if you found Jeff Bezos drunk in an alley? And I was like, I don't think I would decapitate the man.
I don't think I would either. Like,
I'd probably draw something on his face at the very least.
I mean, see, that makes more sense to me.
Do some punking. Like maybe that's what Nephi was like. He's one of those like angsty teenagers, like, you got punked, Laban. Oh dang. I'm trying to save this story somehow, but let's talk about what happens in here. So the text states that Nephi smote off Laban's head.
Yeah.
And then put on his garments and armor. Now the 1828 Webster's Dictionary defines smote in such a way that it can only be understood as a good, clean, single strike that removes the thing from the other thing. So if you smote a branch off of a tree, you took that axe, you swung it, and that branch came right off in that swing. That is what smote would denote, according to the Webster's Dictionary according to the dictionary of the time.
That's exactly what you want when cutting off a head as well.
Yeah, generally. Otherwise, it gets pretty grim. Yeah. And then he's gonna take off the garments and the armor. He's gonna do like a Hitman Agent 47 routine, switch into those clothes, and then go in that disguise and be totally stealthy, unseen. Pretty legit.
I have a nursing background. There is no way that man would not have been just absolutely Carrie from the prom covered in blood. There's no way.
So yeah, decapitation is a bloody process.
It really is. And that just to me is...
In preparation for this episode, I did the math. And if we assume that Laban is having a fairly regular blood flow through his body, that he's still alive at the time,
that might change things a little.
He might be dead, and if he's dead, then lifting up his head drains out the blood just by the gravity of it, and then by the time he swings the sword, there's nothing left in there. Nothing squirts out because the heart isn't beating.
But he probably wasn't already dead, because then why would God say cut off his
just
head?
smote him,
like have a deceitful God, right? Who's saying, "Hey, kill him," but he's already dead. Right. Then like Nephi's hands are like kind of like literally and metaphorically clean.
Yeah, if God wanted to, just puts a heart attack right in that man. Like.
Right. But then the story gets messy in its own way.
Anyway,
much like Laban's head.
Right.
Little messy.
But hey.
Back to the math.
So yeah, but back to the math. I did the math on this, and basically you're going to, in the initial cut, drain out like the blood from the head is going to be, and by the way, like content warning for this conversation, it's going to get pretty graphic. When you cut off the head, the blood comes out, and there's about a liter of blood in the head. So if you picture going to the convenience store and buying a liter of your favorite soda, pour out about half of that in an instant directly down. And that's how much blood is probably going to leave just in that first instant, directly down towards the clothes, the body, all of that. The rest of the blood's going to come out of the heads after, and you're going to get the squirt up from the neck as the first few heartbeats, as the heart continues to beat for upwards of several minutes afterwards, as it's splurting out what it can of blood, with most of it, about a fifth, actually. So about a fifth of the blood is going to go up towards the head.
And we're not.
But you've got to take into consider.
Go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say, you got to take into consideration, this man is so drunk, he can't function. Alcohol super dilutes and gets that blood flowing. That's why you have the red nose and you start to feel hot, because all of that blood is coming to the surface. So that's going to make it even worse.
So blood pressure will be higher.
Not higher per se,
lower.
But the blood,
the flow increases.
Yes, because the blood is thinner.
Yeah. Now he is unconscious. We can assume a slowed heart rate at this point. I would put it at around 40 BPM. And I did some of the basic calculations off this. Now we have to remember that you're losing a particular volume with each contraction of the heart. That part of it is going to the lungs. Nothing's going to leave the lungs at this point. It's just going to kind of get trapped there and create its own little pneumonia. And then on the left side of the heart, about a fifth is going to shoot out to the it's going to shoot through the carotid arteries, and but that flow is going to decrease fairly quickly. If I had the correct boundary conditions and all that at play, and could remember how to do partial differential equations, probably could actually model this out, but that just seemed a level of math that wasn't necessary, and I would have to put a bunch of extra assumptions. Yeah. Anyway, we're probably looking at between like half a liter to a liter of blood, ultimately, plus an extra like 0.2 liters of blood that are going to end up on Laban's clothes. That's a lot.
It's a lot of blood.
That is a lot. It's going to be on the street, on his clothes, on Nephi's hands. It's messy. And that's ignoring the fact that decapitation is not really that easy to actually do.
Yes. This was something that I did a fair bit of reading on in preparation for this. I found a few different accounts, mostly from the Middle Ages, because that's when we have a lot of our accounts. We have a lot of writing from then. But heads are the same. Let's see.
So what you're
Generally.
saying is that we just need to hope that the police don't check any of our web histories before.
Honestly, we're probably all on a
Gotcha.
watch list at this point, just from looking
Yeah.
at
That makes
like
sense.
stuff about
That
First
makes
Nephi
sense.
1 through 5.
Yeah, I have a lot of weird stuff in my search history from this one. But in my defense, I could say I was writing an essay or something. So
But God
But all-
told you to, so it's okay.
here's a couple quick stories of decapitations that went wrong. 1473, we had Margaret Pole, who was beheaded with a block and axe. The executioner was inexperienced, and it took a couple strikes, noted as a pretty messy affair. Another one, Anne Boleyn, 1536, famous person. In
Heard that
England,
name before.
they brought an expert swordsman, I think one of Henry V's wives. They brought a swordsman in from France, an expert, specifically to perform the execution to make sure it went smoothly, so that it wasn't like an ordeal. Like they wanted it to be, relatively nice for Anne, I guess. So they brought in an expert. So
That's really sweet of them.
yeah, really
Yeah.
nice.
This is what happens when you hire a French executioner, I swear.
Exactly.
Every time.
It didn't go as well for Mary, Queen of Scots in 1587. That might have been one of Henry V's. I forget. But anyways, that beheading also required 2 strikes. And we're talking about a situation here. These beheadings were done either head on the block with an axe, or the person kneeling down, head bent over for the cut.
These are idealized conditions.
These are the ideal conditions. This is also the way it was done in Japanese ritual beheadings that have the person kneeling down, neck exposed, executioner next to them, the proper distance away to hit with the right part of the blade that gets going the fastest, et cetera, et cetera. We can talk about cut mechanics in a bit, but these are ideal conditions, and they still went kind of wrong.
Right. Yeah. And these are people who are trained. Like you're talking about people who know what they're doing.
One
They're
of them was inexperienced.
One of them was inexperienced. Okay, fair enough. And that went badly. One of them was experienced, and
by
it went
all
badly.
accounts, I think it went fine. Actually, the one with the guy brought in from France, I think, went just swimmingly.
Oh, okay. All right. So if you
Wait,
know what you're doing.
wasn't there one of King Henry VIII's wives that did not go
one of those is
so well?
One of those has to be a Henry's wife.
Yeah, that sounds.
I think that's Mary, Queen of Scots.
Well, Anne Boleyn was his wife.
Was Anne Boleyn?
And then and then
well, there's like 50 years between these two, so I forget.
Yeah, and like I think that one of his 87 wives, was he Mormon? He had a lot of wives.
The original Brother Brigham.
No, he was not. Okay, so Anne Boleyn was one of Henry VIII's. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have idealized conditions, and we have a success rate of less than 100%. When experience is not involved, stuff generally goes bad. And if you don't have the right tool for the job, things are going to go bad, generally speaking.
Exactly. That's another thing. Executioners' weapons, of course, this isn't always the case, but in Europe at least, a lot of them tended to be flat, heavy, broad blades that are just great for cutting. If you look at a guillotine, we've got a nice, flat, heavy blade. An executioner's axe, big, flat blade. Executioner's swords, you can find a lot of pictures of them. They're big, chunky blades. They don't even have points because they wanted a lot of mass up near the tip area where you're actually hitting the head.
So is Laban's sword, do we know, is it the type of sword that would, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't remember anything hardly about his sword. So, is it going to be the type of sword that would be effective as a decapitation weapon?
The Vered Jericho sword, if we assume that the Sword of Laban was similar to the Vered Jericho sword, the Vered Jericho sword would not have been ideal for this sort of head cutting. It's got that prominent central ridge I was talking about earlier. Now, this is a feature on lots of swords throughout history, up into the Napoleonic era. Pipeback swords, different types of swords. Regardless, they're known to not be the very best cutters. You could still kill someone with a sword like the Vered Jericho sword. Absolutely. It's got a great blade. Cutting off a head, I think, would prove a little bit more of an issue.
Right.
Now, that's not the only blade shape that is found in the area, but that is the blade shape of this type of steel sword. That's kind of this aggregate. You've got the iron, you've got the steel edge. That is the blade type we have for this steel sword. So unless they had flatter profile steel swords, you're just going to have a hard time with the Vera Jericho sword.
And I would imagine that, like with most swords at the time, you're not really interested in making one that's capable or designed for decapitation. What you're
I
looking
bet they'd
for
love
is
to if they could, but yeah, no.
I mean, it would be so expensive ultimately to
Yeah.
try and actually get that kind of refinement and all, and like really difficult to
They just
use.
didn't have the technique.
Right. You know, we're not needing to kill like lurs as Aragorn here. Like what we're needing to do is, for the most part, if you need to kill somebody, doing a slash just across like the throat is enough to do the trick. Stabbing them in vital organs is enough to do the trick. And sometimes you need to get through armor. And from what I understand, if you want to get through armor, doing some more thrusts is generally better because you're creating essentially a single point and putting all that pressure behind there. And that's the armor is weaker to that action than it would be against like a broad, wide cross or long cross section.
Yeah. Generally, stabbing is going to be better against armor, depending on
So
what type of armor too.
Obviously, right? I mean, each armor is going to present like some different benefits to different kinds of attacks, but generally speaking, at this time, if you can stab somebody, you're going to have generally better outcomes for what you're trying to accomplish with your killing action. And you don't need to go through the action of decapitating, which can, if it gets messy, and it almost certainly will get messy, put you in a bit more of a compromising situation. Yeah. So
I had no business cutting off this man's head, to be perfectly honest. He
like,
could have done it in so many other ways.
So does God tell him to do it in this method, or is that just
No.
what Nephi chose?
God just
Right?
says
He's
kill
just
the
like,
guy.
so
God
Nephi's
says
just
slay
like,
him.
Yeah.
So Nephi's
And
like,
Nephi
I'm just gonna
says
go whole hog.
he
and
cranked it up
just
to 11. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So I mean, decapitation is to make a statement, right? Like because there's so many other ways to effectively kill somebody. You're going to decapitate if you want to make a statement.
And that's why it's execution method, because you're making a statement. This is an awful way to be killed. It's a desecration of the body.
Right. Yeah. So if you want to decapitate a Laban, you need to be pretty good at doing the decapitations. You need to have the right equipment for the job. You need to have the proper body position. You need to align the body itself in the proper position. And you need to also know that there's going to be blood. Like no matter how well you do it, blood is getting places.
Are we going to talk about Nephi's method here?
Yeah, let's go ahead and compare Nephi to this. So Nephi in the text grabs Laban by the hair of his head, lifts up the head up in front of him, extends it out arm length. And then he is, I guess the furthest, right? So I'm going to assume that Nephi is like the majority of the population and is right-handed. And with his left hand, he is going to lift up Laban by the hair of his head. And if we, go back to the picture here of this representation, you've got this Laban that's laid out on the street. So he's laying down on the ground and he's going to get lifted up by the hair of his head. That means that Nephi, at best, would have been swinging the sword. If he's going at full extension, he's going to just hit Laban in the side of the head with basically his fist. He's going to punch Laban in the head with his fist attached to the hilt of the sword.
And that full extension is an important part of a good cut. To cut off something like a head. Let me talk real quick about this. Is stuff that I teach all the time in my historical European martial arts class. Not head cutting, but cutting in general. There's a few things you need to know and you need to do. One is a proper extension of your arms, right? There's a little drill I usually do. I have people get in the push-up position. Is it easier to hold your weight on bent arms or with straight arms? It's easier with straight arms, obviously, right? If you have your arms nice and straight, you can put the weight of your body behind that blow a lot better. You're going to need some force behind that blow. So Nephi in this position has to compromise his body structure in order to hit Laban's head with a good part of the sword. The base of the sword, where he'd likely be connecting, is not the best part to cut someone with. You want to be a little
Right.
further out to get a little more of that kind of leverage action.
But isn't
it
this a
going faster.
giant sword? That seems to me like that would be awful heavy to try and be holding, because if you're holding a grown man up by his hair, I don't care if some of that man is still on the ground. The head itself is a fairly weighty part of the human body, and then you've got his whole torso you're trying to finagle, and then you've got this, what did you say, how many inches, 40 something inch
It's a
sword that you're
42-inch
trying.
sword. Now, the sword
So
itself would be relatively easy to handle. It probably wasn't super heavy. 42-inch sword,
Okay.
total length from end to tip. It's not going to be that heavy.
We're talking like a couple of kilos, right?
No, less than
that.
Less than 2 kilos, certainly.
Really?
We're talking
That
less.
surprises
We're
me.
talking less than 3 pounds.
Wow.
Oh, well,
Okay.
then I rescind my doubt on that.
I mean, nonetheless, though, I mean, so and if I were to play, let's imagine that it's just like the heaviest sword around, just for the sake of argument.
Say it is a 3-pound sword.
Because what we still have in the text is Nephi describing himself as being large of stature, very strong. Like, I mean, he's putting all that into the text as well. So he may have the strength. And he may be able to put that strength behind this blow. But you're right. It's 42 inches long. He's not going to hit. He's not going to hit with the idealized spot, even if he's doing this short strike.
Yeah.
So let's say that his arm, his left arm is 42 inches long. This is going to give him, right? We're giving him an extremely long arm because he is large of stature. He's a tall dude.
His arm's probably 3 feet long, 36 inches.
Probably, but let's for the sake of argument here, we're going to give him like these idealized circumstances. Even then, he's going to have to swing that sword around, and if he's doing that right against his body, with like nothing but like just shoulder strength in that strike as he slashes across, like he's still not hitting with that idealized spot on the blade, and he's certainly not getting it right. And his body stretches all around. He's not getting that twist in that he needs to get.
Yeah, he can't put the twist in the hips because he has to hold on to that head, so he can't really like rotate through because his arm has to stay in that place. He's locking his shoulders, so he has to do this swing with just the strength of his arm with bad arm structure.
And like you're not going to get good form with this either. Like your body, you need to get that blade going through the neck just at the right angle with the right form. There's no way he's managing that. And this is not a Nephi who's experienced at cutting off heads yet. That's going to happen in 2nd Nephi when he goes to war with the Sword of Laban. But at this point in time, he's never killed anybody before. This is his own admission in the text that he
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Please.
So, okay, medical standpoint, the reason that for the most part that you see historically that a head is going to be removed from a body, you're going to have the person, I would say patient, but the person who is about to be no longer with us, moving forward with their head bowed. Because the way the spine works, you're not going to get a clean cut unless you are able to see the vertebrae, see that you're cutting between them. I feel like in the middle of the night, dark, drunk guy, head in hand, magic sword, 42-inch long arms, you're not gonna hit.
Right, you need to get right in between, right through the discs between the vertebrae.
Yes.
That's where you need to cut. Otherwise, you're going to hit bone, and that's going to ruin your day. But if you can get through that soft tissue in between, yeah, you can make this cut possibly. You still have to go through a bunch of sinews and fibers and blood vessels and a bunch of other mess.
Yeah.
All of which it can get stuck if your blade's slightly off. I'm thinking about like the like samurai sword, the katana training exercise where you cut through the bamboo, those lines of bamboo that are next to each other, and you need to have really good form. Well, Tommy's like on the ground. I can't remember what the name of the bamboo poles are.
What's used for practice cutting is the mats on the ground, and they roll them up into a tube.
Do they do that in tubes, individual tubes along the way?
Yeah, the tatami mats. Yeah,
interesting.
That's what we use in historical European martial arts too.
Cool. So I mean, you're using it there, and I'm thinking about like those cuts with a katana, which is actually pretty well designed for this particular kind of action.
Yeah, it's got that nice wedge shape.
Not ideal necessarily in terms of like its weight, but in terms of like the actual shape of the blade, pretty solid for wanting to do this. And there's plenty of historical accounts plenty of historical accounts of people being decapitated using a katana, or a katana being used in the act of the decapitation. But like, if you mess up in your form on that strike through the tatami, your blade will get stuck. That is part of the exercise, is to make sure you have really good form going through that, to make sure your strike is good, clean, consistent all the way through.
It takes years of practice. I'm not great at it. I'm not the best at it, and I've been doing this 7 years.
Well, and here's the thing. Here's my follow-up. I don't care what that man drank. If somebody starts cutting my head off, I am going to suddenly be very sober. So
I'll be very sober the second he grabs my hair.
I mean, so even if somebody comes at that carotid artery, they haven't affected your vocal cords yet. You still have time to scream. So there were I mean, Nephi even says he wasn't a super great head cutter offer. So
he'd never killed anybody before, at least.
Right. So I feel like in that aspect, somebody would have heard something. It's not going to be a completely silent situation.
No, there's some gurgling. Yeah. There's definitely some gurgling at the very least.
That first strike isn't going all the way through. That smoke gets stopped halfway, and there's some unfortunate sounds.
And now we already have something that's ahistorical in terms of what the text presents, right? The text is using the word smote. That didn't happen. That's problem number one. Problem number two is going to be the blood everywhere. So that's an issue. Doesn't really necessarily make sense with what gets described with Nephi putting on Laban's garments and armor, unless I heard one apologist try to defend that particular position by saying, well, the text doesn't make it 100% explicitly clear that garments and armor that Nephi puts on are the ones that Laban was wearing at the time. But then you
so he's just got luggage with him when he goes out clubbing,
or you have Ninja
armor,
Nephi.
Right out the luggage.
You have Ninja Nephi getting like a silent assassin stealth kill, sneaking into Laban's bedroom, putting on the garments and armor that are in Laban's bedroom without alerting any of the guards around from there, then sneaking back out past those guards, walking up to Zorn, and then finally kind of revealing himself as the cleanly dressed Laban that he is disguising himself as.
He must have put all his perks into the stealth tree.
I mean, right.
And deception rolls as well. Like, he has to have like advantage on deception rolls.
But if he could have done that in the first place, there's no need to kill Laban. Leave him in the street.
At which point in time, right? So either he's putting on the bloody clothes of Laban, or he's doing the super stealthy actions that he could have done from day one without going through this bloody act of murdering Laban.
Crazy.
I mean, this is where like we have either like some moral issues that pop into play with the text, or we have some historical issues. If you want to resolve the historical issues, you're now presenting some huge moral problems. But your resolution to those historical issues still doesn't make sense. And so I don't think that this story is working out very well for being historical.
It didn't happen this way.
It didn't happen this way.
It didn't happen this way.
And this is why the slide mentions that this is like a practical impossibility. Unless you're going to start basically saying that like God magic was involved to make this work, this didn't happen. And the instant you invoke God magic into the account, we have moved out of the realm of any discussion of historicity.
Yeah.
We can't say, and this isn't to say that God magic doesn't happen. It's to say that we can't evaluate that historically speaking.
Right. And so if God magic does happen, why was it imbued in the blade and not into any of the previous steps in this process that could have made this far less murderous and bloody?
And now we're to a moral issue in this conversation. Yeah. So any resolution that we come up with that solves this story historically will fall into problems morally speaking. And that's why I have not found a resolution to this story that works out favorably for Nephi's account.
So here's my backup question. Would you say that, so then my question's not going to make sense. So what is the point? What is the point of falsifying something that would so easily be able to be, even in the time that Joseph Smith wrote it, at that point, historically speaking, there was no such thing as a steel blade at that point in time. So what is the benefit to falsifying something that is so glaringly, and the first story that we're going to come across?
So I'm going to try to
There's some
take that
conjecture that
question.
could work here.
I'm going to take that question and basically say that when it comes to Joseph Smith developing this story, what I see in First Nephi is a lot of like self-insert fiction in this. That Nephi is, and other critics have pointed this out as well. Like they basically, you have Lehi as representing Joseph Smith Sr., you have Nephi as representing Joseph Smith Jr., and you've got the other siblings playing different roles based off of other siblings or other accounts, or other experiences in Joseph Smith's life. And so this is something of, I think, a wish fulfillment story. I think that what this is the idea of good triumphing over evil, being able to destroy evil, and having justification from God to do things that may feel that may not feel very good to do in the moment, but because God is commanding it, we have to do it. I think that this is an account of God providing a way to accomplish a certain task, and that solution maybe not appearing right or good to our particular understanding or our particular context, but it is still the way that the Lord has provided. I think that is what we're seeing in this, and we have an uneducated, though very intelligent farm boy writing this story, writing his first novel, as it were, and just kind of making first writer errors in this presentation. I really think that First Nephi 1-5 encapsulates that beautifully, of somebody who's familiar with the Bible, familiar with a lot of things that are said in the Bible, but not necessarily the best storyteller, or he's a fine storyteller, but not necessarily the best writer who's going to like refine down these ideas and have them edited in a way that's logically consistent, coherent. And not somebody who's really worried about that either. This is what he needs. What he needs to accomplish is most likely, and this is going to get into the speculation, so take this with a speculation grain of salt. Most likely, the 116 pages mention these brass plates that Lehi possessed. And now, in order to keep that story consistent, Joseph needs to get those brass plates and explain the story again in a way that's going to be consistent with what Martin Harris was aware of.
Hey guys, can we take a quick break?
Sure.
I'm going to be gone for just a second.
Okay. Is it okay if we ramble just a little bit on this while you and we'll drop you out of the stage? Okay.
So now is when we can talk about him.
We can talk bad about him. Yeah. No.
Yes.
So what we have here with this particular writing, I think, is Joseph Smith trying to accomplish the same story beat that was on the 116 pages. And what he needs to do is get the brass plates in their hands, and the justification that he comes up with is this story. And it's just first writer putting down ideas and telling a story. And I don't think that there's anything necessarily deliberate or malicious in that. Yeah. I think that what he's doing is trying to tell this account and trying to say, hey, God is going to provide a way for these things to be resolved. And even like this youngest brother who is beaten by his brothers earlier, who's very submissive and meek, can be made to triumph over the mighty through the power of God. Like God will provide these ways of doing that.
So you're essentially, we're looking at a child who in real life was probably bullied by his older siblings, who is fan fictioning. That's not the best way to explain it, but who is fan fictioning a situation where maybe things turn out for the little guy.
Maybe that's what's happening here. And I've done a few different approaches to this text before in other ways that I've discussed it with other people. And I don't find a solution besides Joseph Smith is just writing down a story to be much more satisfying than that. Like this is somebody who's writing a story, first time writer, self-insert fan fiction, as you put it, and just telling a story of the good person vanquishing the evil person, having the Lord provide that particular way, and fulfilling this task that was that needed to be fulfilled through these other means, or through the means that God has provided. And yeah,
I can see that. And let me just say, a legitimate ninja, that the Pope,
yeah.
a legitimate ninja. How cool is that?
You should see him doing martial arts. Like he's quite talented. Has been for a long time.
That's
and
so
that was
fascinating.
That was one of the reasons, really the big reason why I wanted to bring him on for this episode. While I was like excited to have him on in general, this episode in particular was the one that I was most excited about having him on for. We're going to bring him back on. We were just talking so highly about you.
Oh, shucks.
I told
you can't see it over here, but I'm blushing.
Oh yeah,
Perry,
I can see it in the owl.
I was telling Perry, I was like, dude, a legitimate ninja. What?
I haven't been a ninja in a long time.
We're tired from that game.
That's awesome. Love the reference. But yes, I was like, that's so cool. An actual ninja.
It's it is pretty awesome. I have sparred with the Pope before in non-sword related martial arts. And
I wish you could spar me with the sword related martial arts. They're a lot of fun.
Honestly, it would not go well for me very, very quickly.
I was gonna say, would you have a Laban moment maybe?
I mean, I did some Star Wars lightsaber sparring before, but that is not at all the same. Those were fun.
Doesn't he get like an automatic +5 religion buff being the Pope?
I think so, honestly. And
I got all kinds of
he gets an advantage on certain religion roles, but disadvantage, I think, on other types of like arcana.
Arcana's not my strong suit. Yeah.
The things I want to say that would be, I'm holding my tongue, and I feel like I should be blessed for that.
I've been playing a lot of Baldur's Gate 3 lately, and so
oh man, I bought that game and I was playing it, but my graphics card keeps crapping out in the middle.
No,
it's unfortunate.
It's a heavy
I was
game.
going the other way. I'm reading about Catholic Church history, so like mine was the totally other direction.
You know what? Let's be nice to the Pope. He just made it so that his still homophobic church can at least bless gay marriage or gay relationships. So
you know what?
I didn't know we did that.
That is at least better. That is at least better than Salt Lake Brigham Young Mormonism, I will say. Or actually, Brigham Young Mormonism in general. I will say that the Catholic Church.
That is what it says on our ads. It does say at least better than.
At least better.
It does.
Than.
At least better than Salt Lake.
That's.
I got that tattoo when I was in Young Women's. All of us did. It was a pretty special time.
Nice.
Yeah.
At least we're better than.
The holy and righteous tattoos of the Young Women's Program. Yes. We have gotten a little bit off track here.
I take full responsibility, and
I do blame you, as I was trying to salvage this idea of how Joseph Smith would have come up with this story or what his motivations would have been, and offering a little bit of speculation to it. I don't know that there necessarily would have been like a textual influence from outside in terms of the story development. I think this is just really consistent with the first time writer coming up with a story and needing to accomplish a particular objective. Like I think that this part of the Book of Mormon is one of the clearest examples of that.
Well, and that would make sense because you're going to pull from the text that you're most familiar with anyway, and his anime of choice is the Bible.
That is his particular anime of choice. Yes,
pretty much.
I think now all three of us have independently come up with this particular analogy of Nephi and the boys being like anime protagonists. I had an early attempt. I've recorded a couple of episodes. I will never release them, of me reading the Book of Mormon, offering some critique on that, and I do describe them as anime protagonists in this. In my pregame with the Pope on this, the same analogy came up, and now Lolo, you have done that as well.
Stay tuned for our sports podcast, pregame with the Pope.
Right, that is we're.
Well, at least we're all like-minded. Dang it!
Apparently, I mean, when you read along in this text, I think that's what you kind of see is that this is just it's a consistent analogy, and I think it's a fair, since we've all three have come up with it independently, I think it's a fair assessment of the
I was
text.
gonna say, I think it's kind of accurate.
Let's talk about Zoram. Let's talk about
Yay!
Zoram, who is
Zoram.
just way too chill. Like, Zoram, my dude, your boss is showing up in blood-drenched armor, my man. He is. You can smell it. You can smell the blood. There's so much of it. You can. I know it's dark, but those clothes are just too dark now.
There would
My
have been
dude.
at least a candle inside or something.
You thought he was hanging out with the elders of the church, like, and now he's asking you for this brass codex, which is its own historical issue, which we might talk about at another time.
Do you guys listen to the new album by Brass Codex? It's pretty good, actually.
Yeah, I have no.
Oh man, that
Sorry.
should be our band name when we start a band, guys.
Brass
That's
Codex.
what we're called. Yes.
All right. I mean, so the
Sorry.
anachronism here is that the codex largely did not exist at this point in time in history.
Right.
That is a later innovation that comes up with like the printing press and all of that. And brass plates in and of themselves would have been its own set of issues, though we have found written records inscribed in brass around this particular time. So, for what it's worth. The Pentateuch being on this is its own other set of anachronism that I actually think is going to be a lot more of an issue for the faithful position. Anyway, Zoram is going to go and get this for his master, who is covered in blood. Now, honestly, if I'm a debt slave like Zoram and I just need to get out of here, fine, my boss is showing up. I'm not going to say anything about it. Otherwise, it might not work out well for me.
It didn't work out well for the last guy, apparently.
Probably not.
So for me, if my boss shows up covered in blood, I will get him whatever he asks for. I'm not even going to question that. Boss, you're covered in blood. You want some brass codex? I will do this thing. Not a problem.
I would at least look twice at his face, though, probably.
Yeah, I guess so. But then that's God magic, right? That's God magic made him.
And again, we can't really rely on God magic too much.
How many interactions has Nephi had with Laban at this time to be able to impersonate his voice? I mean, unless Laban had a very distinctive voice that was easy to impersonate, I don't know. I mean, maybe Laban sounded like Eric Cartman from South Park and was just kind of you put it all at the front of your mouth, and ma'am, and it's all just right up there, and he was able to do that. I don't know. That may be possible, but it doesn't seem like they necessarily had a whole lot of interactions together for this to be able to happen as well. It's just another issue in the story.
Jokes aside, Zoram should have been a lot more suspicious. And
honestly,
maybe even raised the alarm.
But
you
at
see
no
the blood,
point,
you smell the blood.
He leaves the city. He walks out of the city walls, just going along, chatting with him. How was it hanging out with the elders of the church? Did you have a good time with that, boss man? It's super great. I think that this is super, super interesting. Where are we going? But I'm not even going to ask where we're going. Oh, hey, who are those
prime
people?
Body hiding location.
Yeah, seriously. Is that copper I smell in the air? This dude is just too chill. He is, yeah. It's also worth noting that Zoram is described as the servant of Laban, and servant did not mean he was the butler. He was not the paid butler. He was a debt slave. The historical Zoram would have been a debt slave. And it's interesting, and I kind of need to do a little bit more of a look into this, and we might want to do a discussion about this on the side about how Zoram goes from being the servant of Laban to joining Lehi's family. And Lehi is another wealthy patron within the city of Jerusalem, another wealthy refugee in the city of Jerusalem at this time. And how one of the first things that Lehi does after Zoram's arrival is give Zoram a wife. And there are certain textual things that might be kind of interesting about that. It would be a reach, but it could be an interesting exploration of the text. I would not want to do that in this context, but we may want to do that in another context as kind of a side video talking about Zoram's potential relationship with Lehi.
Isn't there some at some point in these first 5 chapters, doesn't it talk about there being a familial connection between Laban and Lehi?
Yes, yeah. So they're
Kinda.
both the Josephites.
From the same sort of tribes.
Right.
Okay.
That's the
So
extent of the familiar connection that's established by the text. It gets no
okay.
more specific than they are both descendants of Joseph.
And I don't
So
think,
we're not talking like cousins that we have run into each other at Thanksgiving.
I mean, if they're rich and they run in similar circles, maybe. But
Maybe.
I don't think they even mention that they're of the same lineage until they are looking through the brass plates and they see the genealogy and they're like, "Oh, check it out."
That's spot on.
Okay, so that's not something where Nephi would have had a lot of interaction with Laban at any earlier.
There is
Impossible to really tell.
There is no
Fair
textual
enough.
indication that they had ever interacted before they tried to buy the brass plates from Laban.
They at least knew
Okay.
that Laban had them. So
They at least
knew
knew
that
of Laban and what he had.
And Laban, again,
Fair.
is a prominent figure within the religious circles. And but Lehi appears to have been more of a fringe figure. But it's weird. I feel like Lehi would have been like notable for his fringe views in that space, as well as his wealth. I feel like those things would have presented something that would have made him some renown, not necessarily for good, but he just would have been known.
Okay.
Laban definitely should have been known, but disappears entirely from any sort of historical record after this ahistorical account of his murder.
Okay, that makes sense. I understand. I'm caught up.
So
I do know something about the Mormon Church, the LDS Church. I do know things.
It's only when Nephi breaks character that Zoram shows any suspicion in this incredibly suspicious scenario, and then he tries to run away. And Nephi, who again is going to talk about how super awesome and strong he is, grabs Zoram by like the back of his like shirt collar and like he's like, "No, join us." And Zoram is like, "Okay, dude, covered in blood, who pretending to be my master. I will definitely be joining you.
I am on board. Yes." Well, and like, I remember them discussing at one point. I remember that there was a comment that we brought up in seminary. Woo, seminary. About the size difference between Laban and Nephi, because apparently Nephi, the way he is described, is almost Andre the Giant-ish. I mean, not actually, but a very large stature person. And Laban is not described as having that same stature. Is that accurate to say?
Okay, so Nephi is described as being young but exceedingly large in stature. Laban is implied to be a grown adult. And I think what is implied in the text is that you have a Nephi who's about the same age as Joseph, around like 1820 or so, but being very large. And
He's
so
the
he's able
size
to
of a grown-up.
He's able to fill the space of Laban, basically,
of a strong
who
guy,
is who's himself a strong adult human man.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So that's how I read it. I understand that there are some people who try to read this as like Nephi being a giant. I think that that's just an erroneous reading of the text. But
that makes sense.
It not necessarily erroneous, but it's an overreach in what the text actually offers.
Yeah, it's kind of like he's big for how young he is, not
right.
Right. So he's the same size as an adult man, even though he's 14.
Like
got it.
14. Yeah, that's how I picture it. But you know, the text is so. We're going to see this in other places. The text is sufficiently vague that you can kind of insert whatever response you want to that issue.
Right. That makes sense.
So let's just kind of wrap up here with like the historicity of First Nephi chapter 4. So there are historical challenges to the text before First Nephi 4. We talked about some of those in the context that we have Lehi as being this figure of some prominent or of some wealth, but not necessarily of some prominence, but he's still inheriting these particular theological ideas that are conflicting with each other, which would have been possible, but it's also not necessarily reflected very well in the text itself. And there are some issues with like the way that his language and learning would have developed, but again, these fall into like the possible, but the text itself ignores a lot of those conditions that would have contributed to that development. However, First Nephi 4, in and of itself, just looking at the internal elements as we've described, just discussing what happens in the text by itself, did not happen. Like it is a practical impossibility from any sort of historical analysis for that to have actually occurred. Now, could there have been a historical Lehi, a historical Nephi, a historical Laban, etc., so on and so forth? Possibly.
Yeah.
We haven't ruled that out. But this story, as described in First Nephi 4, did not happen.
Okay. I agree with that.
Yeah, so the Book of Mormon is not 100% historically reliable. We move on our spectrum of the Book of Mormon from 0 to 100% historically reliable. We can now rule out 100% historical reliability from this equation. Yeah. So we're now somewhere between. Sorry, go ahead.
It might be worth noting if you can find a historical document that is 100% accurate, that would be pretty neat.
That's true.
Any historical document.
But also, if we find a historical document that's inspired by, to be like the true revelation of God and the most correct of any book. Now, again, this is why there are other sections of the broader Mormonism movement that does not accept the Book of Mormon as being 100% historically reliable. And for those particular sectors of the movement, I don't think anything we've presented here is necessarily a challenge. But for those who do need for a higher degree of historical integrity to the text, this is a problem. But at least what we're able to do in our context as we go through the rest of this podcast is we can say, hey, the text isn't 100% historically reliable. Let's look at how much of it might actually be. And then in the cases where we can really evaluate that, we can see how well it latches into this historical framework.
Yeah, that's the Book of Mormon I was raised on, was the 100% historical, truest of any book on the planet.
The most correct of any book. Man can draw nearer to God by it than by any
At least in the Brigham Young Mormon branches, that's what is generally believed, I think.
Right. Well, and there's an entire section of books that you can get at any LDS bookstore that Footprints in the Sand. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the names of these books, but the whole purpose of these books is to say this Book of Mormon is a historical document, and these are the reasons why. Mm-hmm. But I mean, it's pretty easily debunked, I feel.
Right in the very first full story that we have in the Book of Mormon. In fact, I believe that this is just the first full chapter of the original. Whoops, this is not showing up properly in my. There we go.
Oh, there we go.
The first edition of the Book of Mormon.
That's a good binding.
The first chapter is just this account and the original.
So it
text.
starts at the same place in the original text.
Oh, yeah, so it starts
with this story.
But the way that they did the chapter breakout was different, and there wasn't any of the verses. And so the first chapter is basically First Nephi 1 through 5.
Okay, I got you.
So this first full story, we can tell, is not historical in the way that the text is presented, in the way that the story is presented. This did not happen. Even if these characters were historical, which is in and of itself an issue that we have to grapple with as we're going through this text. Even if these characters were historical, this story is not.
Yeah.
And that puts into question, like, when this text is trying to, be this presentation of a history of a heretofore unknown people, this is a problem. And it raises some legitimate concerns about the historical value of the rest of the text.
Well, I mean, this is first impression. If legitimately the first thing you put in there is pretty easily debunked as historically accurate, how can you go and say, oh, yes, this is the most historically accurate book of all time, most true book ever?
I guess it says it's the most correct, which doesn't necessarily say.
And that would be the apologetic that would come in. You are correct in saying that, the Pope, because this is one of the things apologists will lead in with.
You gotta play with those words.
They're going to play with those words and kind of try and push those boundaries as much as they can. But what I would note, if I can recollect my thoughts here on this is the very first story that we are confronted with, and when we're evaluating the historicity of this text, we only have a handful of actual testable claims. The book, and we're going to talk about this like in grueling detail when we get to Nahum, about how like testable claims actually factor into our evaluation of the Book of Mormon, because there are not many. This one is, we can actually take a look at that, and it doesn't hold up. And if the testable claims don't hold up, the untestable ones, maybe we don't actually regard as being as reliable either, because we need to have a basis for trying to rely on these untestable claims that the Book of Mormon is making. And when we can test it and it doesn't hold up, why should we rely on the untestable ones? And that's what this chapter needed to succeed on, and it doesn't. And that's an issue. Now, if you're going to hold the text at arm's length, and you're going to do something like Community of Christ does,
just like Laban said.
Yeah. if you're going to basically hold this text in the same way that Community of Christ does, well, okay, the story isn't necessarily devastating for the truth value of the Book of Mormon for its utility of Scripture. But for something like the Brighamite traditions that do hold this much more closely to the chest, this is a problem. And when you think about like Ezra Taft Benson's like leaning into the Book of Mormon as being this text for our time and being authoritative for our day and our circumstances, and it prophesies of things and gives portents to things that are going to affect us in the here and now, like this historicity problem is an issue. And maybe we don't.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and I'm a convert. As a convert to the church, the Book of Mormon and its historical accuracy was the absolute foundation of what they came at us with. I mean, that sounds terrible. But when we were learning about the church, is if the Book of Mormon is true, then Joseph Smith's a prophet. If Joseph Smith's a prophet, then the church is true. And legitimately, that's one of the linchpins.
We need to do an episode about that epistemology, by the way, like a side episode, not in this particular vein. We need to talk about that way of going from, if the Book of Mormon is true, Joseph Smith was a prophet. If Joseph Smith was a prophet, then the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the true and living church on the earth today. We need to talk about that at some point in time.
Jenga tower.
It is one of the first seeds of doubt that I had on my mission, and I really want to talk about it at length with somebody, and we should do a side episode on that. This is it's a great topic, but you're right. Like, we lean into the historicity. I remember teaching people, Spanish-speaking mission in Texas, and the Pope was in Uruguay. I remember teaching people, and they would somos los Lamanitas. Like, we are the Lamanites. We are these people who are described in the Book of Mormon. They saw themselves that way, and if that's based off this historical idea that the story is historically true, and if it's not historically true, that whole attitude being imposed on people, I think, is a moral problem.
Yeah.
And we've moved out of this realm of this is just an interesting thing, or this is just something that people can accept and hold at arm's length, to something that is kind of an issue that really does need to be grappled with, because it is affecting people's lives in the way that they see themselves in the world. And it moves that issue from being the argument of you can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone. And here we are talking about the church, right? That comes up in all these places, but this affects people. And I think this is why we need to discuss this, is because of the impacts that taking these stories literally has on people.
Well, and I mean, I think in a way it's kind of a-hole move, because you are, I don't know if I'm allowed to say cuss words on podcasts.
You can say whatever you want. We're now 2.5 hours into this, or 2 hours and 15 minutes into this almost. And so the YouTube and Instagram, filters have long since given up on us.
Well, I think at this point it's kind of an asshole move, because you are taking a legitimate people, the Israelites and the people who lived in the Middle East at this time, and you are taking a legitimate group of people, the Native Americans, and saying, well, the only way that these people can be here and be on this planet is because God decided that these people over here were going to come over here and just turn into a completely different race. I feel like that is taking away the history of two different fully functioning, fully established ethnicities of people, and just saying, that's God magic.
that really leads into this so beautifully.
Hey, go me.
Like, I think that like with like Sariah and her complaining about things, and this is exactly why I think this is so important, because Sariah is like, what are you doing to our family? You're leading us out. You're having these visions. You're leading us on this like journey into the middle of nowhere. My kids are definitely dead. You sent them to
Sending
this
my
place
sons on
where,
dangerous Mission
like,
Impossibles.
to a man who is known for his violence apparently, and like we haven't heard from them in days. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing to our family, Lehi? And as a result of basically listening to Lehi, you have the colonization of the Lehites in the Americas. If we assume a historicity, they're going to colonize the Americas. They're going to go to wars with each other. They're going to fight with each other over God belief. And all these destructions are going to happen because of that. Instead of the people that were already existing there being left alone. And apparently, if we're going to run with the apologetics, this destruction is going to be so severe and so complete that the Lehites are going to be erased from like genetic history, from archaeological history, from like every possible way that they could have like presented. And yet this story is going to be used. The story of these people is now going to be used to justify colonization efforts into the American West, west of the Rockies. It's going to be used to justify all sorts of actions taken against the indigenous peoples that were living there. Like the saints that settled in the Utah Valley used these texts as justifications for the way that they treated the indigenous people. Now, they didn't necessarily need an excuse for doing what they were doing, but this text provides that for them. And
it gives them permission because God said it was fine.
Right.
God's
Kinda,
down.
yeah.
And God said that this is what's going to happen to them. God said that they were going to basically be beaten into the ground, beaten into the ground, beaten into the ground until they're eventually like taught the true ways again, and they come back into the fold. That's how it's going to go.
But the truncheon.
Right. Until then, they need to be chastised. And this is what happens because in the account, they do not listen to Sariah. They do not stay. They do not set up a home outside of the place that would be destroyed and then choose to rebuild the people and their homelands. They could have done that. They could have like waited out the exile, waited for Jerusalem to be destroyed and pillaged, and then gone back in with true theology in their homeland and made sure that when the exile ended, that those people would come back to a home that they recognized, to a faith that they recognized, to a tradition that they recognized, and remain consistent throughout. And instead, the Lehites are going to leave, and they're going to set up shop in the New World, and they're going to colonize that New World, and they're going to try and force their religion onto these people and their language onto these people. And
I think it might be worth noting that the Book of Mormon never mentions any other people. It never mentions any integration. It never really. It kind of assumes no one lived there.
The population amounts, though, that actually show up, like you have to have an existing population present in order for it to make any kind of sense at all. But that is an issue we'll get to when we get into like Second Nephi and Jacob and those places where we'll see how population just doesn't. And then population is going to continue to be a problem kind of throughout. And all the wars through Alma and Helaman, we'll talk about how the Book of Mormon itself doesn't really seem to understand how populations work. And it doesn't really have that perspective, and it's one of those historical hits on the text. But I do want to highlight that like there's only so many named women in the text, and Sariah is the first one who is named, and her chief presentation is complaining about her visionary husband, who is the prophet.
Gotta keep them women quiet because they do not know what is intelligent. They're just supposed to be.
There will be women who do have. There will be women who have a more positive portrayal later on in the text. I think Alma is the until the story of Corianton is the most forward-thinking about women text in like the entire Book of Mormon. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in a positive way. But you're right. Like when our next comparison is Sariah, who I think is like the next best. It's not.
But in the story, she does come around, right? And you know,
when her kids show up.
And obeys her husband like a good woman should.
Yeah, when her kids show up. Basically, when her complaints are resolved, like, she's good. But until then, like, I mean, she listens to her husband, she stops complaining, but it's not until her kids come in that they have all the celebrations that she's good with things. And I just think that that's worth at least investigating and noting that, like, hey, if they had actually listened to Sariah and Laman and Lemuel, They may have made the old world a better place instead of colonizing the new.
Right.
That's not what God wanted. He
According to
wanted
the
blood.
text. According to Lehi
That's
and
true.
according to Nephi, that's what God wanted.
I mean, got to go run around, cut off some folks' heads, steal some slaves, and then you're good.
Yep.
Clearly the better plan.
So I really do think that one of the issues that we see is that when people speak for divinity, or when they think that divinity is speaking to them, they're capable of doing like really horrible things. This appears throughout history, and we just need to be careful when engaging with those kinds of ideas. And that people who think that they're receiving those types of messages should receive help before they actually like cause harm.
Cut off somebody's head.
Yeah.
Exactly. I forget where I heard it exactly, but recently the idea was put forth to me that I think personal revelation is a personal thing. It shouldn't be allowed to cross into that realm of affecting other people, right? No one should expect that their own revelations should coerce, et cetera, other people, or that they should be allowed to do stuff to other people based on that. And that kind of flies in the face of, a message from God, I guess. But it's also like, you hear someone else's spiritual stories, it's like, okay, good for you, right? That's yours. Put that in your pocket. That's great. But the rest of us are going to do what we want.
Right.
It's interesting you bring that up. I had a very similar question when I was looking to join the church. I was like, it seems like everybody's kind of getting information from God about everybody else. I was like, shouldn't that be something between them and God? And this is how that was justified to me is if you love somebody enough, you become responsible for them. So God will give you revelation about them.
It's pretty twisted.
Yeah. And here's like for me, this has been the issue since I really began my faith deconstruction, because the brethren, the Quorum of the 15 in Salt Lake City, talk about having like being special witnesses of the name of Christ, and they talk about having like revelation for the world and all of that. But when you like drill them on how their revelation works, it is no different than it is for anybody else. They have no special experience that's in any way distinguishable from the personal revelation described by any member of the church.
Really?
And if that's the case, yeah.
When you dig deep enough.
Yeah, they
like
do
to
not
talk
mention
in terms of I'm a special witness, but they don't have anything to back that up.
When they talk about the way they receive revelation, when you actually get them to describe it, they will describe it the same way as anybody else obtains revelation in the church. And if
also
that's
the same way the Heaven's Gate cultists receive their revelations on a different.
Honestly, a documentary worth watching if people haven't watched it, where the members of Heaven's Gate talk about their revelations for that reason, because it doesn't look that different. And if that's the case, if we start taking their ideas as being authoritative for the rest of us, it creates issues where now when Dallin Oaks talks about like LGBT issues, or Ezra Taft Benson describes like the civil rights movement as a communist plot against the government, which he did in front of the John Birch Society, not in front of the church, but still invokes his apostolic authority in that particular speech.
I was going to say, it doesn't matter who you're talking to. If you're the prophet, you're the prophet.
When they engage with these types of ideas when they engage with those ideas in that way, and they present it as though they have special revelation, and yet it's no different from the way that any of the rest of us do it, it creates this type of issue where you have a person who's acting as a vicar for God, who is basically capable of cutting off heads because they think that God is telling them to do it. And we don't have a reason to really rely on that. And personal revelation, fine. I'm okay with that. But you start imposing that on other people, and then that's an issue, unless you can actually demonstrate that, hey, you've got some sort of special access. And Salt Lake has explicitly disconfirmed that they have any sort of like special woo going on in their particular process.
My part of my nursing history is I worked as a mental health nurse I worked at a family practice. I also worked at a mental health hospital, which I will not name. I I can't tell you how many times I had people come in who heard God. And I mean, I'm not saying everybody that hears God is mentally ill. I'm not saying everybody that gets revelation is mentally ill. But if you follow back to what you were saying, Perry, about, Pope, about, what is personal revelation? It's for you and between you and God, not you. And I'm not going to go, and God's not going to tell me what to tell Perry and Pope, because that's personal revelation for y'all. I'm just saying that I saw that come up often. That's one of the most common things. And, mental illness didn't just start in the 60s.
No. And with the character of Nephi, I've talked about this in other contexts before. With Nephi, you have somebody who, because of like a special message from God, murders an unconscious man in like a very gruesome way, and never expresses an ounce of remorse for that action. Never through the rest of the text does he mention an ounce of remorse for having killed a man, an unconscious man in the street.
I think the text itself sees that as a moral win, as God's justice was served.
He did a good thing. Yeah, it was like, woo, okay, good for you, bro. Not, hey, nice you cut. Just.
And that is not consistent. That is not consistent with somebody who has a healthy mental state. And again, when we look at the text, I think that when we read the text, if we instead see Nephi and Lehi as troubled people who are unreliable narrators in this account, then we start to see a much more complex and interesting story underneath the surface.
Yeah.
Because now Laman and Lemuel are going along with this out of fear instead. And when they lash out, yes, it's wrong. Like Laman and Lemuel beating Nephi with a rod, assuming that happened, was wrong. Right. But cutting off a dude's head is also wrong. And the fact that these things are like the moral right thing was the decapitation and the moral wrong thing was the beating with a rod. Like textually that's the case is troubling. And yeah, I don't think that is a consistent moral message.
I honestly never really looked at it like that, because you're so ingrained in Nephi is good and yay and boo, Laman and Lemuel are bad. It automatically is going to taint or color anything that person does, because you are looking at them through the hero versus villain lens.
Yep.
So beating, oh, that's horrific. Totally cutting off a dude's head. No, God said it, so it's totally fine.
And one of the things to note with this is that you have these refugees who are escaping ahead of the destruction of Jerusalem. And they're going to go to the New World. And they're going to set up their settlements, their colonies there. It appears from the text, if you assume that there was an existent population present, that the Lamanites decided to integrate with the people that were there. They decided to immigrate and become a part of the culture and the people that were around them. They decided to join with those people and take part in their culture. And the Nephites were imperialists who wanted to establish their own civilization as being superior over those that existed there in the present. That's going to be used as the settler mentality justification of manifest destiny. And it's similar to those ideas. It's either parent to that or child to that, depending on your perspective. I would say it's child to that, but it is still, we can see a reflection of that in the text. And the idea of integrating in with these people who were already present is seen as the bad thing. And yet I would contend that Laman and Lemuel, in so doing, are the most moral characters of this particular family. Even though they did wrong things, even though they made mistakes along the way, they're still the most moral characters in this particular family because of the action that they take to integrate themselves in with the existing population and to try and actually become a part of it and find home and community with the people already present.
Which is a much more sure path to peace.
I agree.
I think, I wonder if it's too dark to bring up the situation with Israel-Palestine. But I think if people move
I don't think so.
that area,
I think it fits perfect.
So when that country was set up, taken over, if integration had occurred instead of segregation, I don't think we would see what's happening in Gaza right now.
Agreed.
Of course,
You
that
know,
whole area is way more complicated than that.
it's so
So
complicated. It was going to be a messy
say for sure.
situation, but
But that would have been at least a much better step towards a peaceful society.
agreed. And one of the things too that I just saw somebody mention this, and if I could give proper credit to it, I would. I don't remember who said this. I am so sorry to the person that I'm stealing this from. Thank you for mentioning it this way. I don't remember who you were, but thank you nonetheless. They basically made the point that, like, you know, we talk about being a nation of immigrants, but that, and, you know, they talk about like how, you know, well, my ancestors who came here on the Mayflower, they were immigrants in this land, you know, and all of that. And they try to use this as this idea of like promoting immigration in the US. But the fact of the matter is, immigrants, when they come into a country, they take part in the existing culture and they offer up their own culture as an addition to it, as a way to like try and promote like this mutual building up together of the community. Settlers and colonizers, conquest, they impose their own values on the existing society and try to force that through coercion, through steel, through however it is they try to go about that. And the Nephites are settlers. The Nephites are colonizers. Throughout the text, that is what they do. But the Lamanites are not. And even though the Lamanites are portrayed as being like the antagonists of the story, at no point in time do they appear to try to impose their particular view on God, religion, or anything else on others. But the Nephites throughout the text do that. Even the wicked Nephites who leave the society and end up, you know, thinking like Amalekite and Amaron, right? Clear examples of Nephites who try to like, you know, become a part of Lamanite culture and take over the Nephite empire. But they impose their own values, their own view on the Lamanite people. And that is throughout that particular text. And that is the white settler mythology that is placed throughout the text that appears, it really starts here in terms of like the textual line that's going to follow. And it's throughout the Book of Mormon. We're going to see it all over the place in there. And it's a dangerous idea that's celebrated in the Book of Mormon.
I was going to say, it's celebrated. It's not pictured as a bad thing. They're not colonizing. They're not settling. They're bringing truth.
Right. And I think if we twist the text, if we contort the text into a way where instead we see their narrators as being unreliable, as being kind of the actual antagonists, if we see them as the light Yagami of the Death Note story that is the Book of Mormon, or the Walter White of the Breaking Bad that is the Book of Mormon, then we can see them as the villains, and we can see them as these people that are imposing negative values, and we can look at the text differently. And that's why when the Lamanites end up being the righteous people, when like great things happen in the community, when they decide that they want to do things that are good and healthy and communal and all of that, like it's the Lamanites that promote goodness and rightness and peace. It's the Lamanites who take this oath of peace and lay down their weapons of war. It's the Lamanites who promote this idea of like communal sharing and all of that. It's not the Nephites who do that. And I think that it's an interesting way to try to approach the text that will try and actually like magnify and all of that, because there's a seed of something beautiful in that. If we don't take the Book of Mormon at the image that it's trying to put forward textually, you know, front facing, if we don't accept that as is, and we read something else into the text, I think we can find something of value in that. And that was really one of the intentions with this podcast overall, was to find ways of using the Book of Mormon in healthy and moral ways. One last note that I have on this particular slide is about cycles of violence. This is an idea that I am currently kind of toying with, and I think I'll see expanded out in the months and years to come. So I mentioned in the first episode that I consider myself a humanist, but I still believe in the divine potential of man. I still believe in the divine potential of humanity, which I've inherited from my Mormon roots. Right? We are the only species that is capable of recognizing problems with cycles of violence. There is no other species that can recognize, hey, this is a cycle of violence and it's problematic and we need to break that. Humans are the only ones that have done that, that are capable of doing that. The first step to fixing a problem is recognizing that you have one.
Yeah.
So therefore, it would seem that we are the only species so far on Earth capable of fixing the issues associated with cycles of violence. Even though like all of evolution has basically directed cycles of violence so far, we're the only species that may be capable of actually breaking that. And if we have a divine potential, it will be in finding ways of breaking those cycles of violence and in promoting the general health and wellness of basically everything, of all life. and we're the only species capable of doing that. And I think that is, like I said, this is still something that I'm developing as something that feeds into that. And right now I'd focus it very much on humanity specifically, that we need to break our own cycles of violence against each other, and promote this, the wellness and goodness of the entire species. But I think that can extend more broadly to all life on Earth. And
Agreed.
that is our potential. The question is, will we actually ever live up to it?
Yeah. I think when we accept justifications like doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, like Nephi did, it definitely perpetuates that sort of cycle.
Big time.
It does. All right. Well, next week we're going to talk about 1 Nephi chapter 6 through 10. The boys are going to go back to Jerusalem. They're going to get some wise. Lehi's going to share some visions and prophecies. We're going to talk a little bit about the last 116 pages and the apologetics that are offered to that. We're going to do so. We're doing that because it's such a huge deal, and the Book of Mormon mentions it twice. And then we're going to go on to what I think is a really interesting idea, and that's the development of Christology, historically speaking, and how the Book of Mormon is in this absolute rush to get to a high Christology. And we'll talk about some of the issues and interesting developments that come from that particular problem. But thank you so much. Thank you so much to our guest, the Pope, for joining us. The Pope, I want to ask you, do you have any pluggables you want to plug, anything that you want to share with the audience? And it's okay if the answer is no, if you want to share something that's completely unrelated to you that you just find interesting.
Yeah, no, nothing in particular right now.
Because we're the best podcast.
Yes, exactly. Here's the thing. That line about the wrong things for the right reasons comes from an excellent book I recently read called Shantaram. Maybe I should check it out.
Ooh, wait, how do you spell that?
Shantaram.
All right, we'll put the description of that down in the description, down below in the box on all of that, or wherever it ends up showing up on the medias of the social medias, the how many different YouTubers can I steal from here? Anyway, you can find the title of that book down below, and thank you so much for joining us, the Pope.
It's been a pleasure.
And LoLo, next week, you and I are in for some exciting conversation about how Jesus became God. So it's going to be a whole lot of fun.
Is there going to be like a tutorial or something?
Yeah, we'll basically run through the entire guidebook.
From God to Jesus, 7 easy steps.
7 easy steps.
Wait, other way around. Whoops.
The other way around there. Yeah, come on, the Pope. You should know this.
Sorry. Oh man, I've really done it this time.
All right, thank you all so much. This was really fun. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.